Hello. Oh, you're deafened. Okay, I assume Flowtrace will be with us in just a moment here. Today we are going to be reviewing a recent debate. Oh, I got a DM. Excuse me. Let me cover up my screen uh, so I'm not revealing that. Oh yeah. Okay. He says 15 seconds or so, and he'll be good to go. Okay. Um. Okay. So today we are going to be reviewing a debate that happened recently between Jonathan Haidt and Sam Harris. These are two kind of public celebrity intellectual type guys who like to talk about social science and culture and philosophy and a lot of the same stuff that we like to talk about a lot of times on this stream. These are both very well spoken, opinionated people. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. Oh, hi! You look like you just jumped out of the shower.
No, not just.
Not just okay.
Not just. I gave it a good 30-minute head start.
Okay. Well, me too, actually. Okay, so yeah, I was just introducing this video and explaining a little bit about who Jonathan Haidt and Sam Harris are. Do you have anything you want to say about these people or this event?
I'm looking forward to Sam Harris crushing this guy. Let's go.
Oh, really? Okay.
I mean, not. I mean, not exactly. No, I'm quite a fan of Sam Harris. I think he's a really smart guy, and he's a really smart person that I feel like I can find substantive disagreements with. I mean, obviously, I'm not talking with Sam Harris, but like Sam Harris will raise points that I disagree with, but I'm like, damn, that is actually a good point. I don't know. I need to think about that more deeply. Jonathan Haidt, I don't know much about, except that Erudite really likes him.
Erudite really likes him. That's true. He's a social science guy. He talks a lot about. He's written some books about morality and on the kind of emotional approach to morality that people ordinarily have. And yeah. He's written a couple of famous books about that. I think one of them is like the coddling of the American mind, and there's another one. There's another really famous one. The name of it is slipping my mind here. Actually, I will. Look it up and we'll see what is he written. Oh, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. That's the other really famous one, and he's written I think a couple other things besides that too. Yeah, so he's mainly a social science guy, and then Sam Harris has a background as a neuroscientist, but I don't, as far as I know, I don't think he does that anymore. He's pretty much now like an author and podcaster type guy. But yeah, I have a similar opinion that you have about Sam Harris. I think he's a really smart guy. He raises interesting points. He's a fun person to disagree with. King Solomon in my chat says, "Oh wait, is he the contractualism guy?" I don't know. I don't know. Maybe that'll come up in this. I haven't read Haidt myself, so Sam Harris is not a contractualism guy as far as I know, but we'll see. So yeah, I'm ready to go whenever you are, unless you got anything else you want to add.
Nope, should be good. Let me know if that's working for you.
I can see it just fine. I'm not yet sure about the audio.
No, it's not playing.
Let's
Here,
just focus on religion for a second, and we'll get to the.
Oh, okay. Can we turn it up just like slightly?
Sorry, turn it down or up?
Up.
Yep.
So religion, as
Thank
you've
you.
pointed out, is more than just a set of beliefs. And and you've argued against me as though I have disputed that, which I actually haven't. But you're not alone in this. Many people do that. So I just wanted to track through a few of the things you say in your book and then talk about them. So, I mean, you say in your book, The Righteous Mind, that this is a quote, trying to understand the persistence and passion of religion by studying beliefs about God is like trying to understand the persistence and passion of college football by studying the movements of the ball. You've got to broaden the inquiry, end quote. So now I think that analogy isn't quite right, but I actually agree with your general point. Religion is obviously more than what people believe. And Yet I think it's totally coherent and, in fact, necessary to worry about the specific consequences of specific beliefs.
Yes.
And so let me just reform your analogy a little bit and get you to react to it. So, because I think it's somewhat, to stick with your analogy, it's a little bit more like asking the question, why are people on each team always tending to run in one direction? I mean, so if you see them running sideways or even backwards for a few moments, it's always with the purpose to get
This
the
is Sam
ball
Harris
to the other end
speaking,
of the
in case
field.
anybody's
So
unfamiliar
what
with
is
the two
so
of them.
special about the ends of the field that everyone wants to get there? And to explain that, you have to understand the rules of the game. In particular, you have to understand what a touchdown is. But once you know that, more or less everything these people are doing is easy to understand. And again, there's more to. I mean, there's all the people out, having tailgate parties outside the stadium, right? So that's part of the spectacle. But to understand what the most energized participants are doing in this situation, all you really need to know is what they want and what they believe will get them what they want. And so I would argue that this is true for the most destructive behavior and moral attitudes we see inspired by religion. So when you ask yourself, why is ISIS throwing gay people off of rooftops? It's because their scripture tells them to. It's actually written in the rule book. Now, in this case, it's the specific injunctions in the Hadith. It's not in the Quran, but it's part of the larger rule book of Salafi Islam. And I mean, you can say anything you want about religion being more than just beliefs and doctrines, and you can talk about doing and belonging, which you do in addition to belief, as being central to religion. And you can talk about the power of ritual and strong communities and the importance of transcendence, which is something that interests me. And I agree about all these things being interesting. But if you want to explain the behavior of ISIS, all you really have to know are the rules of the game as they understand them. And if their rule book changed slightly, let's say their rule book on this point said, don't harm homosexuals under any circumstances, simply force them to recite the Quran for 12 hours a day and actually create a special caste of priests that there's homosexuals who just chant from the Quran and who are otherwise venerated, right? I think we can be absolutely sure that this is what they would be doing. In fact, there are analogous behaviors in other religions in human history. So this is why I think specific doctrines matter. And that no one, so you're going to talk about the intuitive roots of many of these things, but no one has an intuition that they should throw gays off of rooftops specifically, or eat a cracker every Sunday and call it the body of Jesus, or oppose embryonic stem cell research. And in fact, ISIS wouldn't even oppose embryonic stem cell research, and the Catholic Church would. And this is why the specific doctrines matter so much.
Okay, so I will certainly grant that specific doctrines matter, and that I think your thought experiment is correct. If there was a specific verse, and especially if it appeared in multiple places, that said, here's how you treat homosexuals, then they would treat them differently. So I don't deny that the scripture matters. But first, to understand your analogy, you tell me, what is the end zone? What do you think they're all up to? What is the thing they're all striving for to get when you use this end zone analogy?
Well, if you're talking about the real players, the real believers who are devoting their lives fully to this, the end zone is paradise and avoiding hell. So it's what happens after death. It's playing by this rule book, playing this game, advancing the ball down the field, is ensuring that after death you will spend eternity in paradise and escape hell.
Okay, so I think this is one of the differences between us, is that I am opposed to the pursuit of parsimony. I think that the social science, human nature and the social science are so complex, and especially if you look at morality or religion.
Parsimony is like
so anytime someone
efficiency.
says the goal of religion ultimately is to attain paradise, or the goal of religion ultimately is to have a sense of meaning, or even closer to what I say, if you were to say the goal of religion is ultimately social bonding and connection, well, those are all goals. There are lots of different goals.
In this case, I was talking about ISIS. I was talking about what we would call the extreme committed, death cult of Islam. Now, there's analogous cults in other traditions, but I'm not saying that all religious people in every denomination of every level of commitment, that their main goal is paradise. Some Unitarians don't necessarily even believe in heaven, right? So I was speaking about ISIS.
Okay. Yeah. So I can certainly grant your point that beliefs do matter, and I hope I never said that they don't. But I think I would still claim that your analysis here is is too focused on the explicit. And this was, my main criticism, my main concern about your writings on religion was I sometimes felt like you were writing, your two religion books. I felt like you were writing those mostly with the Bible and the Quran and the New York Times on your desk. And you were sort of saying, okay, well, look at this verse or look at this event that happened. And then just trying to make sense of it yourself. And I was thinking of it much more both from a kind of a Durkheimian point of view or a, unconscious motives point of view. I mean, there's just so much going on here. And I have not studied ISIS. I don't know what's going on with them.
I really don't like the argument of you're looking at this from this viewpoint, and just sort of vague allusions to that as like a criticism. If it is true that Sam Harris is not getting a comprehensive view of religion, which it probably totally is, you need to show what his specific view is missing. Right? When you look at it this way, you're missing these parts and make a specific attack. Now, maybe he's about to do that, but I don't like the idea that the fact that he just sort of mentions, well, you're looking at it with, these books on your desk, whereas I'm looking at it more from this perspective. And it feels like he's about to sort of just go into some generalities. No, if we're going to critique specific viewpoints by which you're analyzing something, we need to critique those actual viewpoints. We can't just say, oh, it's limited, it's flawed. Everything's limited. Everything's flawed. What specific limitations or flaws is Sam Harris running afoul of because of his limited perspective here?
I really, really agree with what you just said. Nobody has a comprehensive view of religion. We only ever can look at it through some particular lens of analysis, and no matter what lens that is, there's always something that we're going to be missing. So then, merely to point out that there's things that he's missing is uninteresting. I agree that I would really like for him to spell out specifically what is important that he's missing and why it's important. Yeah.
And there probably are important things he is missing, but in order for us to understand and comprehend those, we need to know them. It's not enough, right? Because that's also going to inform, is Sam Harris's view fundamentally incorrect or incomplete? Is Sam Harris saying things that are wrong? No, this isn't true, Sam Harris, you're cherry picking. Or that's true, but there's other things that sort of color are the way we process that true statement that he's not mentioning. That's a big difference that it needs to be ascertained by actually having the back and forth on the specific points.
Yes, I agree, and Jonathan and I did agree already that, like, on the specific example of, like, why are they throwing homosexuals off rooftops, and like how would they behave differently if their scripture told them to do, to instead just be very kind to homosexuals, that they would, like, right? It seems like they're not agreeing on, or they're not fighting about that specific point. They are agreeing, and I'm inclined to agree as well. It's like they are just kind of following the instructions literally that are given to them, and I think it's a little bit easy sometimes for people to lose the forest for the trees when they're doing this kind of analysis. Like when you're saying, like, you're being too literal, it's like, well, yeah, it is possible to be too literal, but it's also possible to overlook obvious explanations, in favor of more subtle ones, and kind of underrate the importance of the kind of literal analysis.
But I don't believe you could understand them by reading the Quran and saying, oh, the Quran says this. This is why ISIS is doing it.
Well, the
motives of humiliation, geopolitical. I don't know what's going on, but there's a lot going on.
But the issue is that this is how they understand themselves. And now here I'm not just speaking about ISIS, I'm just speaking about religious fundamentalists in general. When you ask them how they understand what they're doing, if you ask them why homosexuality is anathema, for instance, they have a scriptural justification for it, and it does explain the belief and subsequent behavior, and where in certain cases nothing else does. I mean, so it might be relatively easy to come up with other non-scriptural reasons to be uncomfortable around the phenomenon of homosexuality, and we can talk about that. I mean, this gets into your kind of moral intuitions, the moral foundations theory. But for many of these things, the only way this idea could ever get into someone's head is based on the tradition and the explicit teaching on a specific point.
Agreed. I agree with you on that point. And so let's make a distinction that I think will be very helpful here, which is between fundamentalism and religion more generally. So if we're talking about fundamentalist movements, then you and I are going to agree much more, including in the moral evaluation of them. And so if we live in a diverse society, if we live in a society, or if we value progress and open debate of ideas and challenging each other and the things we need for the sciences, then fundamentalism is incompatible with all of those things. Christian fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, I would say politically correct fundamentalism or social justice fundamentalism. I think you and I both personally dislike the fundamentalist mindset, I should say. I don't mean the people. I mean the fundamentalist mindset is opposed to values that you and I both hold as individuals and for science. So there, I think there's not as much disagreement between us. But then, if you say, what about non-fundamentalists? That's where I think you're much more negative than I am about people who are religious but not fundamentalist. Is that true?
Well, yeah, I'm more negative in the sense that I feel like they make one honest talk about the problem of fundamentalism much more difficult because they don't want anything too critical said about their holy books or about a tradition of venerating the concept of revelation, right? I think revelation is a problem here. The idea that one of our books was not the product of the human mind, but the product of omniscience, that already just deranges our intellectual and moral discourse really beyond saving, and we have to get out of that part of the religion business. And so that insofar as moderates and liberals do, well, then my only real concern is that, well, I guess there are two more concerns. One is they tend to not be intellectually honest about the process whereby they have become moderate or liberal. So they pretend that there's something in the tradition, in the books, that has been self-purifying. But no, when you go back to the books, they're every bit as theocratic as they always were. What's happened is that they have collided with a wider set of values, secular values and scientific insights and progress, and they have found being doctrinaire and dogmatic is no longer how they want to live. They can no longer justify it, but they're not really honest about just how that winnowing has taken place. And they tend to give credit to the resources of the tradition, whereas really it's the resources of a much larger conversation that human beings have had.
Sure. So if you want to say that people are adopting positions and then searching for a justification and looking for some sort of textual justification for what they've decided to do intuitively, yep, I'm down with that. That's the core of my research, is that that's what a lot of our moral argument and justification is all about.
Yeah. Well, and so you do one. I just want to go back to your book briefly. You do one.
There's a really important question that needs to be sorted out here, which is that there are two paths, well, probably more than two, but in the context of this conversation, it seems like there are two paths you could take that information in different directions, that Jonathan Haidt and Sam Harris are going on different paths. It feels like Jonathan Haidt is offering that as a sort of defense of the institution of religion to say, well, these people were just looking for any excuse, right? They were, right? It's almost equivalent to saying, if not religion, it would have been something else. And it feels like Jonathan Haidt is saying that is some degree of absolvement of the thing that they used as the excuse. But I'm not sure if Sam Harris would agree with that, and so I hope they don't sort of brush over this, because it feels like both of them are saying, you agree with me, when in fact there's still a great divergence on opinion, even though they agree about that central fact that these kinds of people are looking for something to excuse their behavior.
But the sense that I get of what Haidt's point is probably not anything about whether it's justified or not to do that kind of thinking. I sort of think it's just he's saying, like, it is descriptively true that this is how people think, that people, like, adopt the positions that they feel good about or that they intuit or that are given to them by their culture, and then they go seeking reasons to support it. And that people do this regardless of whether they're religious or not. So simply pointing out that religious people are doing this is like not a particular indictment of religion, because religion is not the scope in which that takes place. Humanity more broadly is the scope in which that takes place.
Mm-hmm.
Thing in your book, which it's pretty clearly an area where we disagree. I don't think we need to go into it any real depth because it may be a little hard to parse here in a podcast, but I think we should just flag it because it is one. I think it's also one reason why you think I and Richard Dawkins and others have been too hard on religion. And it's this notion that religion has provided an evolutionary benefit to us.
Is it an adaptation or a byproduct? You're right. That is the other core factual or scientific issue that we disagree on.
Right. So I just want to introduce this concept of group selection to those who don't know anything about it, and then we can table it probably. But so you defend this notion of group selection, and specifically the idea that religion has helped certain groups survive, and perhaps a lack of religion has caused others to fail. And you think that this mechanism hasn't just been cultural, but that it's also been biological. And so this idea of group selection, which obviously relates to much more than just religion, this is very controversial in biology. And its main champion, who you do side with here, is someone named David Sloan Wilson, who, interestingly, he's also attacked the new atheists with a level of energy that I never quite understood. So I should just point out that there are many biologists, and I would think still most, as far as I can take the temperature on the whole field, disagree with this idea of group selection. And so if our listeners are interested in it, I think the best summary of the reasons to doubt that group selection occurs was written by our mutual friend Steven Pinker.
He's going into the reasons to doubt it, but he hasn't actually explained what group selection is. This is a thing from evolutionary biology, and the idea is if you get the idea that different organisms are subject to different selection pressures, and that's an important facet to understanding, like why organisms evolve to fit the ecological niches that they have. The idea of group selection is that it's not just individual organisms that do that, but also like a group can be well adapted. Like a group of organisms, like let's say like a beehive or an anthill, or even a group of a tribe of hunter-gatherer humans can be better adapted to its environment than the neighboring tribe could be, or the neighboring beehive or anthill or whatever, right? And so if that group is better adapted, then perhaps it outcompetes the other group, and then it has natural selection operating on it in much the same way that like a single organism with advantageous adaptations would have. That's the idea of group selection.
And the title is The False Allure of Group Selection, and that can be found on edge.org. I know you must be aware of that paper.
I responded to it.
So you weren't persuaded by it.
So that is what the debate comes down to, is religion a product of evolution? Is it an adaptation? In which case, that doesn't mean it's still adaptive today, but it would mean that it conferred some benefit. The really exciting idea that so captivated me when I first read Dawkins in college was, wow, what if it's like a virus? What if it's taken advantage of the hardware up there, and it's exploiting it for its purposes? And of course, Dawkins and Dennett are really explicit about that. It's a really cool idea, and I used to believe it. And that was the prevailing wisdom. Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, was an incredibly powerful book and a testament to the power of good writing to be persuasive. So the state of the art in the 70s and 80s was, as you say, that most biologists doubted it. In fact, almost all did. Group selection was dismissed because there wasn't any way to solve the free rider problem. If groups were to cooperate for the benefit of the group, any free rider within the group would get extra benefit, and the genes for free riding would spread. And so the topic was put aside, and David Sloan Wilson was seen as a lone crazy. But a lot has changed since then. So right around that time, the whole idea of major transitions in evolution was being formulated. And there are many other examples of agents that were functioning at an individual level, competing with each other, coming together to be more effective as a group. And even the cells in our body are an example of that. The mitochondria have their own DNA because it was an example of a major transition where multiple entities got together to act as a group. Let's see, what else was there? There's I go through in my book, as though there were four new exhibits, 4 reasons to re-examine the case since the 1970s, gene culture coevolution, things like that. And while it is still true that their biologists mostly seem to side against this, this is actually because I think E.O. Wilson made a big mistake in writing a paper. I love him. I think he's mostly right about things. But I think he made a big mistake in writing a paper saying that kin selection doesn't matter. And I don't understand. I don't think that makes any sense. Kin selection is really powerful. So he took a lot of flack, and people are conflating his rejection of kin selection with his endorsement of groups, or I should say multi-level selection. So just the final point on this is the whole debate since the 60s with Williams and then Dawkins was always looking at altruism. Can we explain altruism as a product of group selection? We are nice to each other because the benefits then to the group outweigh the cost to me as an individual. And my response to Steve Pinker was, well, if you just focus on being nice or altruistic.
I just wanted to explain what kin selection is, because I just looked it up right after he said it. Kin selection is the idea that a gene will propagate more if it not only helps if it helps the organism that has the gene, but also if it helps relatives of the organism who are more likely to also have the gene. So like if there's a gene or a set of genes or whatever that make you more likely to like care for your family or care for your tribe and help them survive and reproduce, then that gene is going to be advantageous to its own propagation, even if you, the person who has it, doesn't survive and reproduce.
Yeah, I think it's basically just it's sort of a version of like for genes or ideas, the sort of benefit of cooperation in the wild that like genetically animals will do. Animals that cooperate or work in packs. I mean, this is just obvious, to us as humans, when 3 humans work together, they tend to be able to achieve more than, if all 3 of them had been working independently.
Right. So then I think where they're going with this is like you can live in symbiosis with another organism, even if it's from a different species, right? Like obviously we have some kind of symbiosis with, domesticated animals and plants that we grow as crops and this kind of stuff. We help each other survive. But then we can also have like parasitic relationships, like the tapeworm can just be a parasite on humans, right? So then I think where they're going with this is like which one of those type of relationships is a better analogy for what religion is doing. Like is it a parasite that's just like surviving by that survives like because it's clinging on to humans and benefiting from maladaptive behaviors or something like that, or is it like as if it's an organism that's like living in symbiosis with us and it helps us more than it hurts us?
Well, then, yeah, it's kind of hard to argue that this is from group selection. But if you look at the tribalism, that's what really got me. That's why I'm on this side of the debate. If you look at tribalism, how similar it is, how initiation rites all over the world are actually mimicked in fraternity brothers initiations. And I don't think it's because they studied anthropology. It's because there's something in the human mind that makes people, especially young men, want to do things that involve painting their faces or changing their appearance, exposing each other to extreme risk, doing all sorts of things that bond them together as a group, make them quite dangerous, quite able to be predators of other groups. So I think you and I agree on those external costs. So anyway, that's why I'm saying that if you focus on tribalism, you try to understand that, I don't see how you can explain that from individual selection. And this is why I think that the arguments for limited group selection were overwhelmed. That's why I say we're 90% chimp. We're overwhelmingly evolved by individual level selection, in the way that Dawkins describes it. But we have this interesting tribal overlay, and I think that's essential for understanding not just morality and religion, but politics, as we're going to talk about very soon.
Right. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't say just a couple of words about why group selection seems spooky from a more traditional evolutionary point of view, and then I'll just get off it because I don't think we'll resolve it here. But I just think, from the point of the criticism, it seems to be a metaphor that gets taken too literally and that blurs the lines between genes and individuals and groups as units of selection. So as you said, group selection is often called multi-level selection.
Yeah, that's the way to think about it.
Right. But, as Steve and others have pointed out, that there are many problems with saying that selection acts on groups in the same way that it acts on individuals to maximize their inclusive fitness, or that it acts on them in the same way that it acts on genes, increasing numbers of copies that appear in the next generation. So these things are operating differently, and I'm dogged by the fact that I feel like this is a little too hard to parse in a podcast for people to listen. So
we can skip it. We can just point people. Actually, I think Chapter 9 of my book. So let's do this. I have made Chapter 9 of The Righteous Mind available for free on my webpage. So if people go to righteousmind.com, they can find my argument for group selection. And if they Google, well, I guess you can direct them but if they basically just Google Edge, Pinker, false allure of group selection?
That's Steve's
they
article.
can find that. So that's Steve's. Steve makes a strong argument against it. So I think we can just pass it off in that way.
Yeah, I mean, so just to crib Steve briefly, the issue is that there's a lot of causality in the world that you don't need natural selection to explain. And so merely having one tribe outcompete another doesn't require natural selection. So, like, for instance, if the Nazis had won the war, right, and we were now living in the first century of the Thousand-Year Reich, this wouldn't be an example of group selection. I mean, and the difference that would make a difference here is almost certainly cultural and not genetic. So if the Germans had won the war, sequencing Hitler's genome wouldn't tell us why. And yet we would still be living in a world where everyone would now be a Nazi, and the Nazis have succeeded. But here again, so when in talking about success, the success of a group, in this case the Nazis, we're using a metaphor here because this is not analogous to the success we talk about when we talk about genes spreading in a population. Because in this case, the success itself applies to the group, the Nazi Party, enduring for centuries, not to some entity at the end of generations of replicators that have been copying themselves with some rate of mutation and then outcompeting all others. So Steve argues, I think, very strongly that it's a confusion over a metaphor. The interesting thing for me, though, is...
I don't know if I agree. I'm just trying to really think through what he's saying there. It's true that the success of a group doesn't necessarily mean that the group itself has some sort of like intrinsic quality to it, or not necessarily even intrinsic quality, has some quality to it, or a series of qualities to it that make it better. But is that necessarily true of a gene? I feel like it would probably be it would be more true of genes, that genes are going to be more selected purely on the basis of the genes, whereas when you're still talking about a group and the idea of a group spreading itself in an allegory to a gene, you're encompassing more. But I can still envision scenarios where, like, you know, a certain gene gets passed along simply by virtue of success that is not due to itself. I guess the question would be, like, are there any genetic traits that we do see being passed on incidentally, not because there's some sort of selection bias?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that happens with genetics regardless. I mean, you could have, two different volcanic islands, and then there's there's some deer that live on island A and some deer that live on island B, and then one of the volcanoes erupts and wipes out the population of deer on one of the islands, and it's not anything to do with, like, these deer were better adapted to survive volcanoes. It's like, no, they just, like, neither of them could have survived that, but just one of the volcanoes did erupt and the other one didn't.
Yeah, so on that level, I don't know if I agree with the criticism, but then as I think about it more, I do sort of wonder if that's probably way more true of one group, of group selection versus, like, individual or gene selection. And just intuitively, I mean, maybe my intuitions are wrong, which is totally possible, but it does seem like I would probably expect there to be more confounding variables like that when you're talking about group selection, as opposed to selection for a specific gene. I actually probably would imagine that that the amount of genes that succeed due to some unrelated variable is probably much lower than the amount of groups that succeed because of some unrelated variable.
I guess,
or at least on a per capita basis.
I mean, I guess when you think about what are the factors that make a single organism succeed at surviving and reproducing, it's like, a bunch of them are just dumb luck environmental factors, right? Like, does a lightning bolt hit you on the wrong day, or does do you accidentally catch the eye of the predator while the other person didn't, right? But some of them are going to be due to your own like genetic traits, right? And so it's like a combination of the two. And I think I think the analogy kind of works with groups, except with groups it's like there's a whole bunch of persistent traits that define the characteristics of a group, and some of those are genetic and some of them are cultural, and then some of the things that happen that decide whether that group thrives or doesn't are going to be because that the group's internal workings are efficient in a way that help it to thrive or don't. But then some of the other things are just going to be like the dumb luck kind of stuff, right? Like maybe your tribe is doing really well on some island out somewhere, and then one day the Europeans show up and introduce smallpox, and there's nothing you could have done. So I don't know. I imagine there's some amount of like selection pressure in the sense that like a group's like genetics and or cultural beliefs could be more self-destructive or more like better adapted to survival or not, but then it's like how much does that actually affect whether that group thrives or not, right?
Yeah, it seems really hard to verify or falsify any of these theories.
Yeah.
With group selection, I think it's
Yeah,
actually
I thought we were leaving it.
No, we are. No, we are. But it's actually a red herring for me because, I'm happy to assume it's true for the sake of argument, right? And it won't actually change any of the things you and I disagree about in this space. Because it seems to me that you draw normative claims from the fact that group selection is a fact. And
Very indirectly, yes.
you seem to be saying that even if the tenets of religion are false, right, group selection proves that religion has still been a kind of necessary social glue. And
Well, hold on. Wait, let me reword that. So I think, look, you and I are both atheists. We're both naturalists. We both believe that religion is out there in the world. It's part of human nature in some way, shape, or form, and that evolution has to do with the explanation for why it's out there. So we're both naturalists. The question at hand is whether it does something or confers some benefit such that if we could rip it out, we would lose nothing or something. And on Dawkins' view, and I think your view, if we could just get rid of it entirely, we'd be better off. And that might be true. I don't know. But if religion is an adaptation, as I believe it is, then it could still be true that it was necessary for getting us to where we are. And I do believe that religion and the psychology of religion helps explain how we and only we made the transition to living in large-scale societies of non-kin. It could still be the case that it was useful back in.
Okay, hold on a second. What do you mean we and only we? As opposed to like the Neanderthals, like fish? I'm not sure if I'm following this.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure what he means either.
Seems like there's some big reasons why other animals could make that transition in the first place. They have to do like with just evolving the necessary brain structure to have like language and tools.
Yeah. He said a couple other things that I kind of want to respond to also. He was talking about what, like, this question of whether religion confers any benefit or not. And I think I don't like the way he framed it, because I think there, like on the one hand, there's a question of are there any benefits to religion? And I think the answer just isn't very obvious. Yes, I think it would be extremely hard to argue that there are no benefits to religion whatsoever. But then there's a different question of, like, is it a net benefit? Like, are the benefits of more importance than the costs? And I don't know. Like, it seemed to me like the way he was talking about it was. I don't think he adequately distinguished between those two questions. Yeah, and then the other thing he said was like, it seemed like religion was necessary to get us where we are, but like that just seems like very historically contingent, right? Like everything that happened historically was necessary to get us where we are, right? Like the Black Plague was necessary to get us where we are. It doesn't prove that the Black Plague was good because it resulted in the society we have today.
Yeah, I think there's also a question of what was it necessary, or did it just happen to go that way? Right, like we probably needed to invent fire to get here, right? Like without the invention of fire, if we hadn't done that, or if the laws of the universe were such that there was no way to get fire or any sort of equivalent useful thing, we probably wouldn't be able to get here. But like, did we need the Spanish Inquisition to be able to get to the internet age? I think probably not. So then there's the question of, well, what about the religion as a whole? I think that's a much more difficult question. And again, man, it's like, these are things that are interesting to talk about. You could have some real logic, but like, at the end of the day, man, it's just like bullshit we're making up. Like, there's no way to verify or falsify any of these ideas, or it seems very, 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 very difficult to do so, to like disentangle that. Like, imagine human history without religion. Okay, good luck.
Yeah,
like,
good luck.
It's like counterfactuals in history. Like, as soon as you get like 2 or 3 like major departures away from what actually happened, like, you're just making shit up, and it's like you don't have any like empirical backing to like make real claims. What if the Nazis had won? As soon as you go 10 years into the future, who knows? I mean, it's genuinely like impossible to figure out.
Yeah, and on the point about the Spanish Inquisition, I feel like in order to have the exact world that we have today, I think we actually did need the Spanish Inquisition to end up exactly where we are, right? But
The exact
nevertheless,
world, yeah. But the question is, would the different world be a better or worse one overall?
right, exactly. So the fact that religion was necessary to get us exactly where we are, it's like, okay, I could buy that, but that's not necessarily mean that it's a net positive, right? Like maybe it prevented us from having the better world and it was necessary to get us to the worst place that we were at, or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Tribal days, and now we've supplanted it with law and other things. So I would never say that religion being an adaptation or the truth of multi-level selection would prove anything about how we ought to live today. But what I do draw from it is that seeing it as an adaptation for group solidarity and group coherence makes it easier to see some of the psychological benefits and socio-structural benefits that might be there that are hard to see if you're a secular person on the left. Because that is what I see, is it's really hard to understand what's good about the other side once you're in an argument or debate with them. And from reading scholarship on religion, from reading books, especially the book, James Alt has this wonderful book, Spirit and Flesh, that really helps you see the sociology of a small evangelical community. So that's my only point. I wouldn't say I draw normative implications.
Okay, I feel like you just kind of contradicted his argument there. Sure, these conclusions you're drawing are not based off of the historical presence of religion across society, but off of analysis of modern contemporary religious societies. It doesn't seem to me that you would, because it feels like he stresses his argument on the fact that, if you look at religious communities today, there's a lot of benefit, and that's almost certainly totally true, right?
Yeah.
There probably is some serious, and I tend to believe that as well. But I don't believe that because, well, all humans have had religion. It feels kind of inevitable. I draw that off of the fact that, well, when I look at most religious communities in my country, in America, or if I look at most religious communities in similar Western, G20 countries, they seem to have a lot of benefits to them. Not, unlimited benefits, but there seem to be some really good things there. Because I like the question would be, okay, Jonathan Haidt, let's take away that evidence. Let's say for the time being, it's not clear to us whether or not modern religious society is giving these kinds of benefits. You can access information. Can you make the same argument purely off of the presence of religion throughout history? I feel like no. The argument becomes weak, significantly weaker, so weak that I don't think it becomes true. So I don't quite understand exactly how he's formulating those two things together.
The mere presence of it broadly isn't enough, right? Because we could say all human societies have all had cancer, right? And it's like maybe there's some argument that cancer is a net benefit to humans or something, but just the mere fact that it's broadly present does not. Or
slavery is probably right up there with religion as probably the most universally practiced institution across human history, across different human cultures in one form or another. In fact, it probably is only slavery and religion that are that universal. So it would seem pretty wild. And the specific argument he makes about well, you don't get to understand from their point of view when you're on the other side. Well, that's the point of view of modern religious people, not of all religious people ever. I don't really. That doesn't seem very coherent.
Yeah, and it may be the case that religion is a net benefit to some societies and not to others, right? So just simply pointing out it's religion appears to be a net benefit to those societies which continue to practice it. It's well, okay, that doesn't, I don't know.
Directly, but I do draw implications for what kinds of lives are happy and satisfying, what kinds of social patterns and structures make people less selfish and more inclined to think about others. And there, I think you just have to think twice if you're going to say religion's just bad and it makes people do bad things, get rid of it.
Yeah, well, so I obviously share your concern for human flourishing and us getting in a position to tune all the dials to maximize it. I guess I was detecting in you some version of the naturalistic fallacy, some version of saying that because this thing is natural to us and in fact selected for and did our ancestors good, that is some argument, some weight on the balance to argue that it is in fact good morally speaking.
Oh, no. I'm only making the argument actually in a way that very much the way you make in the moral landscape. If we're going to talk about human flourishing, we need a full picture of human psychology, just straight descriptively. So I think you and I differ a little in our descriptive picture of human psychology. But beyond that, it's pretty much a straight flourishing happiness explanation. So I see what you're saying, but I'm pretty sure I'm not making the naturalistic fallacy by saying if it's evolved, therefore it's right or good. I'm not saying that.
Right. So it's just if it's evolved, you would suggest that it could be harder to get rid of if bad because we've all evolved to think in these ways. But one distinction I still think in this area that divides us, at least it changes the way we tend to talk about this, is there is a distinction in thinking about how science can touch this subject, and the distinction between how we got here, the evolutionary story of just how we came to have the brains and mental capacities we have, and then there's the question of just what is possible given what we are. And that's, for me, those are two distinct and totally interesting and justifiable projects, but they're distinct, and science has a very different role to play in each. And if you're just going to do descriptive science and talk about how we got here, yes, that has no necessary normative implications. And many people stop there and say, well, so science can't tell you how to live. Science can just tell you why it is you find certain things disgusting, why we've evolved to have very strong in-group, out-group thinking. But, we did not evolve to successfully build a global civil society that's committed to human rights and the free exchange of ideas and racial and gender equality, right? So the question is, can we accomplish this? And,
I don't know if you can say that. Given the fact that we have gotten here, it seems almost unquestionable that we have. I guess to be fair, that's almost like a tautology. Like, we are what we've evolved to be is what we are. Which I guess, but I guess then the question would be, well, by what process did we get here that is not evolution? That is not even necessarily the most strict like biological evolution, but how has if our society hasn't evolved to get here, how did we get here? Because it definitely seems like we've changed a lot and adapted, which I would almost think is a kind of evolution. So I'm curious exactly what he means by that.
Yeah, me too.
No, I think we can. But the further question is, would it be moral to accomplish it? And would it be a bad thing if we failed? And I think, yes, we can answer yes on both of those questions. And the crucial point, though, is that success on this front will entail overcoming a fair amount of what we've evolved to care about. So you cite a bunch of work, I remember Putnam and Campbell being some of it, that seems to show that religion is good for people. So in this case, it makes them more generous.
Yes, in the United States, that's right.
Okay.
It doesn't say globally, but yes, in the United States, there's a lot of evidence that religion makes people happier and better citizens, according to Putnam and Campbell. That's right.
And this is the result of their belongingness to a religious community, not their beliefs and doctrines.
That's exactly right.
And this increased generosity isn't just lavished on their in-group, it actually extends to the rest of society, which would surprise many atheists. Now, I don't actually know whether or not this is true. Let's just assume it is all true. It seems to me that even if we accept that as true, it obviously isn't the whole story. I mean, I think we could design a dozen invidious experiments where we show that religious people are more homophobic, say, or sexist than secular people on average, or have a lesser understanding of science or less respect for science. And this would help complete the picture. But I think the problem I have with this line of thinking is that there seems to be a tacit assumption that if we can show that religion is doing something good for people, there is no better way to get those goods that's compatible with a truly rational worldview.
That's a fine point. I agree with that. But let's see. But you raised a question that I think would be great for us to try to work out here. I think we might come to different views. So you said, I think we both agree that our evolved human nature did not prepare us to live in a giant, global, peaceful, egalitarian society under rule of law. Where, in a sense, we're living above our design constraints, and clearly, to some extent, it's possible because, despite the imperfections, we're sort of doing it nowadays. So our evolutionary past, while it puts on some constraints, they're kind of loose constraints, and we can live in all kinds of ways that we weren't designed for. But here's where I think our different views of religion would lead to different prescriptions for how to do that. So I take part in a lot of discussions. I'm invited to all sorts of sort of lefty meetings about a global society, and the left usually wants They want that global governance. They want more power vested in the UN. I hear a lot
Based.
of talk on the left about how countries or national borders are bad things. They're arbitrary. So the left tends to want more of a universal. I mean, just think about the John Lennon song. This is, what I always go back to. Just think about Imagine. Imagine there's no religion, no countries, no private property, nothing to kill or die for. Then it would all be peace and harmony. So that is the sort of far leftist view of what the end state of human evolution or social evolution could be. Now, is that possible, or is it consistent with our evolved nature? Now, here's the other side. The other side, the conservative view, is that we are fundamentally groupish, more parochial creatures, and to have global governance and one giant country or one giant community of all Earth would be a nightmare. It would be chaos. It just wouldn't work. Far better to have authority at the lowest level possible at all times, and build up with nested structures. So a country ends up, for conservatives, being a very reasonable basic building block, and they would not want as much of a global society. They certainly would want international law. They would want treaties. They'd want all sorts of things. So I think this is a case where if you have a kind of a blank slate view or a very positive view that our basic nature is love and cooperation, and it's only capitalism that screwed it up, you're going to want a kind of a John Lennon vision of the future, and I don't think that could really work. Whereas if you start with Edmund Burke, who talks about the little platoons of society, we develop in the family. So conservatives are really, really focused on the family and lower level institutions. And if you focus on making those strong, and then you think about some sort of a legal and social architecture that allows multiple families and communities and states and countries to work together with a minimum of friction, I think that's much more workable. So getting a correct view of our evolutionary heritage and the psychology that resulted from it, I think is very helpful. It doesn't tell us what's right or wrong, but I think it does tell us which way is more likely to work. And if you see us as products of multi-level selection with a deep tribalism, that suggests that you're probably better off going for more the Burke way and having groups that are composed of groups and finding ways for them to work together, rather than the John Lennon way, which is let's erase all group boundaries. Let's erase divisions of nation and everything else and just have one giant planet.
Can we pause for a second?
I just don't think.
I sort of think human psychology is not encapsulated well by just one or the other of those things. I think we have both of those within us, where like we have family relationships. We generally feel more compassion and more understanding and more closer relationships with the people that are in proximity to us, that we spend our everyday lives with. There just is a different type of relationship I have with my best friend than I have with a stranger on the other side of the world. Like that's just true. But then also it's not true that like the stranger on the other side of the world means nothing to me, and that I must always prioritize like my local tribe over the well-being of the whole rest of the world. And it's like I think the fact that this is a difficult conflict in the first place is evidence that we have both of those aspects to our psychology at the same time working against each other, and that one or the other isn't just the right answer.
Yeah, I think there's a couple problems with Haidt's argument, but I think the most core one is that I think he's taking it as a given that if I demonstrate, if it is the case that human psychology is quite pernicious, that if we got rid of all of these barriers, things would become worse, then that means that these institutions to sort of constrict human psychology and to sort of turn it into get them to outlet in a positive way, those are good things. I don't think that necessarily follows, because it is certainly possible, and I'm sure there are plenty of examples that Jonathan Haidt would agree with, where there were structures that made human psychology worse than it needed to be. And so the question is religion as an institution is the cure worse than the disease, right? Mm-hmm. Is religion helping us turn what would be otherwise be all-out warfare into less warfare, or is it taking us from what would be some degree of warfare to actually a higher degree of warfare? And how do you you balance it out? Now, I think that question is why this question is really hard to. Sorry, I was about to say really hard to answer. It's impossible to answer. I don't know how you actually ever prove this kind of stuff. But I think that's a really important thing. And I think there's also a secondary argument that I think people like Sam Harris would definitely be very appealing to people like Sam Harris, which is, hold on, Jonathan Haidt. When we're talking about religion, we're not talking about the literal institution, but sort of the thought process, the sort of cultural essence of it in practice. That is not necessarily a wholly separate entity from people. When you talk about the propensity in human nature to be violent or to be tribalistic, how much of that is the essence of religion, as we're talking about? What if, when we say get rid of religion, you're envisioning human beings acting completely the same? But when we envision human beings without religion or religious thought or like the essence of of religion, which I think is probably getting closer. Which Jonathan Haidt would say is, well, that's not religion, that's fundamentalism he described earlier. That's a separate question. But people like Sam Harris would say, getting rid of that, those people wouldn't act that way anymore because that's more of a cause, right? That's conditioning us to be in a certain way. So I think that there's a separate argument there that also is worthy of addressal. Although I think the first one is much stronger.
So then it's kind of like let me think, how do I put this? It's like when religious people are doing like bad behaviors that are specifically aligned with the instructions of their religion, to some extent that's got to be an expression of human nature, like finding its way into religion and defining what that religion has become in order to allow them to behave that way. But then also, like, if that is true, if religion succeeds at validating people's like intuitions and nature in such a way that it does funnel people's behavior into these specific bad behaviors, then I think that matters too. It seems to me like it's a combination of the two, right? Like religion is the way it is because of human nature, but then it kind of like pushes people in specific directions because we grow up with it as part of our environment. It's
a giant Ouroboros, and it's like impossible to. It feels like impossible to ever draw any line, whatsoever. It's kind of like Loki's wager. Okay, just cut off exactly where the religion starts and the human psychology ends. Well, I don't feel close, and it's not the kind of thing where all lines are vague. Should people be allowed to drink at 21 or 20 or 19 or 18? Ooh, I don't know. That's tough, but I'm pretty sure it shouldn't be 5, right? That's one thing where it's like, okay, it's hard to draw a line, but we still have a general sense. Man, I do not think there's a shared general sense of what that is for religion at all. And it doesn't feel like there's any tangible points to sort of go back and forth on. It feels like you're just totally lost when it comes to trying to come up with any concrete stuff. Well, at the very least, we know this is all religion. I don't think we can say that anywhere, or at the very least, we know this is human psychology and not religion. Mm-hmm. It doesn't feel like you can draw any line.
I got a chatter who's quoting Tool lyrics at me, so I just want to show him some appreciation for that. Okay, so then the next thing I wanted to bring up was, what do you think of a comparison between this and, like, you remember the Kraut video about realism in foreign policy? So there was this kind of talk about how if you think of things in terms of these broad power balances, like the foreign policy realists were doing, there could be this tendency for people to kind of in the interest of forming a balance, that they could just end up dividing the whole world into two blocks or whatever, like happened during the Cold War, or even this is kind of what happened in World War I also, right? Like, even though there was lots of different competing powers, they kind of just formed two sides, right? And then you just get you have this danger of immense destructive conflicts that, due to people forming these blocks that include not all of humanity, but like if the tribal institutions get to this like medium size, that seems to be like a very dangerous place for them to be at, right? Where it's like, we're not focusing on local institutions like the family. We're also not focusing on global institutions that govern everyone. But somewhere in between there, we just end up with these large competing groups, which if they clash with each other, that's like catastrophic.
Yeah, I think the other sort of parallel is the worry that that you are inventing the thing which you say is inevitable, right?
Yeah.
Oh, if not for religion, or if not for the League of Nations, people would have gone to war anyways. So then, when people go to war because of religion or because of the League of Nations, you're like, well, this would have happened anyways. It's like, okay, if that's true, sure. But what if it's not? Because if it's
Yeah.
not, you're like, if that one factual thing changes, you go from the most moral option to one of the most immoral options. It's almost like veganism, right? If it was the case that, cows or pigs did have some moral right, factory farming becomes like one of the one of the greatest moral abominations in human history. So it's really dicey to be that close on the edge, especially in a situation where, man, it really does feel like we don't have solid answers one way or the other.
Yeah, and I think this is like broadly true of a lot of the kinds of arguments where people say that's just the way it is, right? Like it pretty often implies a bunch of normativity, like even if it's intended as a descriptive statement, right? If we just accept that some description is just the way that things are, and then just go on to behave as if that's the case, well, that can be very advantageous to us if we're recognizing a real fact about the way that things are, but also it's denying us the opportunity to change that thing if it's really not inevitable. And it seems like this is kind of what Jonathan Haidt's doing here. He's kind of making like a that's just the way it is argument about like religion and human tribalism.
Yeah, the tough thing is, it feels really difficult to definitively come down one way or the other. Because if it is true that human psychology does have some innateness towards a lot of these bad things, which I do think is definitely true on some level. I don't know if I'd agree to the specific connotation that John
has to be at least partly true.
Then it is really difficult to say, well, we would want to try and use the guardrails of society to channel that positively, right? Right. And people have talked about this on a personal level, channeling your anger towards a positive end, channeling to motivate yourself to do good things. But man, it's really hard to strike a balance here, which is why I really wish they would go into some specifics, because it feels like it's really hard to take a super big objection to either of them when it comes to this high level of stuff. It would ultimately come down to the specific things you're talking about, like, for example, well, gay marriage, or issues that are based on I'm trying to think of a different example, because that seems like a pretty unfair one to put on the back of, okay, religious people, let's get into the argument. You have to defend not wanting gay marriage. I'm sure there's probably some stronger arguments they would have. Maybe, I don't know, maybe about having local communities or something. I don't know. But the point is, it's really important to not get lost in the sauce on this kind of stuff, because it becomes really hard to come to any actionable information where it's like, okay, here's the point where we disagree, we can go back and forth. You just end up sort of saying, well, what you're saying is true. Well, what's also true? And it's like, okay, that is only so useful. At a certain point, we need to get to a point of contention.
Yeah. I would also like to hear them get into more specifics to address the point about the gay marriage thing. I think the closest I can do to steel manning a conservative argument against gay marriage is something like this. It would be well, they're just, as a matter of fact, there are different cultural communities with different values, and there is no one right way that all cultures have to be, and therefore it's okay for different cultures to govern themselves according to their own, different standards, and even if there is a better way to do gay marriage, it isn't there's no obligation for any specific culture to just optimize itself toward the better way to do every single issue. This just isn't actually how human psychology works. We can't, I don't know. And in order to overcome that, we would essentially have to have some external authority forcing different cultures to practice in ways that they don't want to locally.
Yeah, I think, and because the thing it comes down to is what specific ways. That's going to be the evaluation. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, which is why you have to get into the specifics.
Right.
That's likely to work. I think that is, as with the communist societies, it's making assumptions about human nature that end up, people just refuse to live that way, and it's a disaster.
One thing about what you said that I want to pull back to the focus on religion is just that you're essentially exposing some of the holes in secular thinking. And I agree those holes are there. In fact, I've written 2 books that attempt to shore up some of the weaknesses I see in secularism. And what you just said relates to this very topical example of the recent migrant crisis in Europe,
Yeah, yeah.
where you have, secular liberals for the most part and, atheists who really can't find a rationale, morally speaking, for anything less than an open borders policy. And in fact, so there's two reasons here. There's two connections here because there's this low birth rate in Europe, and many people attribute that to secularism. The loss of religion is really leading to a loss of babies, and that becomes a justification for bringing in immigrants because they need people to work in these societies. So one could argue that for two reasons, both economically and morally, secularists are now in a position, someone like Angela Merkel, where they're unable to find a reason to keep the borders closed. And let's just say that this happens, where you have millions upon millions of Muslims who, on balance, are deeply religious and disposed to have large families. They flood into Europe over the next few decades, and in 100 years, Europe is predominantly Muslim and deeply religious, right? This is a possible counterfactual or actual history. So what lesson should we draw from this? Many people would conclude that what Europeans needed in the year 2016 is more Christianity, right? That only a belief in Jesus and the associated behavior and belongingness that confers and the fertility rates that get associated with a taboo around contraception, that only that could have protected them from the sweeping changes in their society. And I would just argue is that there must be a truly rational way for secular people just to figure out what sort of world they want to live in and simply build it.
Yep, I totally agree, Sam. And I think this is a nice example for us to talk about because I think you and I both are wary of mass immigration, but maybe for different reasons. So first of all, the drop in birth rate, apparently the Scandinavians who give a lot of support for women working have at least, they're still below 2 per woman, but it's not as disastrous as in southern Italy where they don't. So you can have a secular society that, if you engineer it right, can still have birth rates that are not much below 2, perhaps. So I wouldn't say that, Europe needs more Christianity in order to have more babies. But I think the demographic issue is really important for the future of any viable society. But I am a Durkheimian. I think Emil Durkheim got it right. I think you have to see communities as absolutely needing a sense of cohesion, trust, shared values, a sense of who we are. And this is why mass immigration can be a bad thing. Now, I'm Jewish. My grandparents came to America in around 1905, 1907, fleeing pogroms. So I look at the videos, I see the kids coming out of Syria, and boy, it's the same thing. So I'm very sympathetic to the moral case. But as a Durkheimian, I think that you can have immigration if you have massive assimilation, which is what.
I'm just curious, if they're talking about Syrian immigrants, I'm just curious if this came out Oh, this was in 2018. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Interesting.
My grandparents, or more correctly, my parents then went through. So if you have a society that has the moral resources to say, this is America, welcome, adapt, learn English, you get free education, but you're going to be an American, then you can have mass immigration. And it clearly boosted our creativity, our economy. So, there are many good things about immigration. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying, immigration is bad. I'm saying there are many good things about it. But from a Durkheimian perspective, especially Muslim immigration, which is, I think, different from, say, the Mexican immigration that we have. There's no reason to think that Mexicans won't adapt, Mexican immigrants, that their kids won't adapt.
19th century,
but Islam is different. It is it's more of a binding belief. So to have massive Muslim immigration into secular European societies, where not only do you not have assimilation, you have the left arguing, I don't know if they say the same thing there as they say here, that assimilation is genocide, which is ridiculous. But if you have an anti-assimilationist ethos, then I think Europe is setting itself up for massive failure. Their generous redistributionist welfare states can only work if people have a strong sense of social solidarity. And if you have diversity, diversity is divisive. Again, this is Robert Putnam. He has a wonderful paper called E Pluribus Unum on how diversity is divisive. So I think Europe is in huge, huge trouble because it's very hard to make, given the moral case for mass immigration, they're going to have it. But the sociology is kind of worrisome for what Europe's going to be like, for what these European countries that have high immigration is going to be like in 1 or 2 generations.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we fully agree on that topic. And I've actually talked the immigration topic to death on my podcast of late. So let's move to morality proper, because this is really where you've made your biggest mark. And it's an area where you and I both agree and disagree. So, as you've already said, you're very skeptical about the power of moral reasoning. And you don't say that we never change our attitude or the attitudes of others through reason, but you insist that we do this far less often than we think or than anyone hopes. You also claim that most of our seemingly rational talk about morality isn't what it appears to be, because we reason like lawyers and not really like moral philosophers. So most of our reasoning, and by lawyers you mean that most of our reasoning is really in the service of justifying moral attitudes that we arrived at intuitively. And so we're simply in the business of defending and marketing these intuitions, and not fundamentally getting down to some kind of ethical bedrock. And you move from these observations about the intuitive roots of our moral attitudes and the resulting diversity of opinion morally among people to conclude that science really can't hope to talk in terms of moral truth. Firstly, have I summarized that basic skepticism accurately?
Yes, I would only add that my skepticism is not about reason in general, it's about individual reason, the power of an individual to reason. If you set systems up correctly, and this is what's so brilliant about science, if you set systems up correctly so that you have institutionalized disconfirmation, so that each scientist who's totally motivated to prove himself right goes out there and proves himself right, but then you have others to push back. And this is a reasoned process. We really do make our points not by threat, not by force, not by money. We make them by making arguments. And over time, the system sorts out the better from the worse. So if you think about reason as an emergent property of a system that's set up well, then I'm a big fan of reason. And this is why I'm so upset about the loss of political diversity in the academy. And I guess we'll get to that next.
Yeah.
But this is one of the reasons why the academy has just exploded in craziness, is that it used to simply lean left, and now it's almost 100% left.
Right.
But anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. But yeah, as for morality, yes, I think that the basic psychology that what we're finding in social and cognitive psychology is motivated reasoning, and we're just not that good at weighing the evidence on both sides. Rather, what we're really good at is we start with a proposition and we ask, must I believe it? Am I forced to believe it if you don't want to believe it? And then we look for evidence that it's wrong. Or more typically, you start with a proposition, you want to believe it, you search for evidence that it's right, you almost always can find it, and then you stop thinking. So that's why I'm not a big fan of individual reasoning. I think we're kind of like neurons. We're not that smart as individuals, but you put us together in the right way, you get a brain.
Right, but you seem to hold the things we can be right or wrong about in the moral sphere as different from the facts that science treats.
Correct.
Right.
That's right. That's another fundamental distinction between us. Yes.
Yeah. So just introduce this concept of moral dumbfounding for a second.
So when I started my research in graduate school at Penn and then as an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, originally I thought that reasoning and emotion were both inputs into moral judgment, and either one could dominate. That's kind of a dual process model. And Josh Green is the main proponent of such a model. But I kept failing to find that reasoning would work as I expected it to. And I kept finding that sort of the people's gut feelings tended to drive the reasoning. And so I would make up these stories that would pit reasoning about harm versus gut feelings. And so one of the stories was about a brother and sister who are on vacation, from summer vacation from college. They're traveling alone together in France. They staying in a cabin by the beach. They decide one night it'd be interesting and fun if they tried making love. They use 2 forms of birth control just to be sure. They enjoy it, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret between them, which makes them feel even closer. What do you think about this? Is that okay for them to do it? And almost everybody says no. And then the experimenter would say, okay, well, why? Tell me why. And at that point, everybody comes up with a reason. Nobody says, well, gosh, I don't know. I can't explain it. Everyone comes up with a reason. But the experimenter would say, well, okay, yeah, true, birth defects, that's a good reason. But, if they're using birth control, like if they could be sure that there's no baby to come, then is it okay? And nobody would say, oh, yeah, sure. If there's no baby, then it's okay. Rather, if you knock down the reason, they say, oh, okay, yeah, well, let me see. Okay, oh, how about this? Yeah. And they come up with the second reason. You knock that down. And after you do this a few times, then eventually people say, gosh, I don't know. I can't explain it. I just feel it's wrong, and I don't know. I can't explain it. So that's moral
Debate bros stay
dumbfounding. And
winning.
that I took as evidence that gut feelings can support a moral judgment, even in the absence of any articulable reason.
Okay, I agree with everything Jonathan Haidt just said, except Jonathan Haidt now do Why is Murder Wrong? And I think you'll really start to, I think, get at the based position of moral nihilism, I think is the technically correct thing. Basically not believing in moral truth. I think it's, I don't know, more seriously. I mean, I don't know, I should say more seriously, because I do genuinely believe that. I just think it's very... This is something that I don't have a good answer for. And yes, it is true that a lot of moral systems are based off of moral intuitions, and we do a lot of work to justify those.
Yeah.
But, like, is that inherently a wrong thing? Because my moral system, and I've thought about this quite a bit, not to say that, I'm the best, moral thinker or anything, but when I think of, I don't like human suffering, why? I don't really have a reason. But then I seek to come up with a system sort of evolved from that. That doesn't seem like, a bad or necessarily wrong thing. And I think it's very, I think it's the question of where does it become wrong to just say, oh, why do I believe this? It's my moral intuition about everything. That's clearly probably something that we don't want, right? We don't want to set an unworkable system where all your conclusions aren't conclusions, they're just immediate intuitions, right? I think Donald Trump should be president. Why? It's a moral intuition, same as why you don't like human suffering. That probably seems like a bad idea. But equally, there are probably, it's probably okay, I think it is okay to be like, why is human suffering wrong? I don't know, I just feel that way. So trying to then draw a line where how much of your system is those intuitions that then you're creating a logical system to work up from, that's a difficult line to draw, I think, for how much of that should be intuitions, how much of that should be conclusatory, logic.
I think when you were saying we don't want to have the world where almost all of our moral reasoning is intuitive, I think that's just the world that we actually do have. It's just like if we incorporate into that the idea that a lot of our intuitions, they don't just come from nowhere, right? Like they're very dependent on some of it is just like probably some evolutionary psychology reasons for it, and a lot of it is probably like cultural stuff or things that are based on experiences that you've had that make you just feel a certain way that you can't necessarily explain give a reasoned explanation for it. Like once you put all those things together and say this is where our intuitions come from, then I think virtually all of our moral thinking really is just justifying intuitions.
I don't know if that's true, because it feels like there are movements that stay really stuck on certain issues that they would otherwise be that it feels like people. I'm trying to think of a good way. Slavery and abortion feel like things where the moral intuition very easily could have been to just ignore it, rationalize it away as something that greatly benefits you, but people still were huge sticklers on it in a way that I don't think is fully explanatory by just saying it's just intuitions on every level. It feels like there are some intuitions that are a lot stronger that then people will use to sort of will build logic from that will contradict other intuitions or learned moral positions that they just sort of took for granted. Not to say that, again, because it is still working out from intuition, but it feels like there's more like internal logic against that. Like I think throughout a lot of history, particularly with chattel slavery, it was really hard for people to justify or rationalize why this is okay. And you see historically, tons of Confederates had who would say things like, oh, I don't support slavery, but, and then there's just a million different reasons why. There was a big tension there. It felt very difficult for them to just say, oh no, slavery is okay. Or same thing with abortion today, right? There's a lot of people, whether or not you agree or disagree on abortion, I think there's a lot, most of the people that are anti-abortion or not, anti-woman, they really have a hard time thinking away, rationalizing away why it is okay to kill a human fetus, because they think that there's some moral value there. And I think those complex logic trees that evolve from those intuitions being put into conflict with, what would be, would it be beneficial for you to just, say, oh, I just want an abortion, it might grant you great individual convenience. I think that reticence is a thing that is not fully explained with the idea that everything is just moral intuitions and there's no sort of logic going on underneath the hood, even if that logic is built on deeper intuitions.
Okay, I think I disagree with this. So like when so you were saying that there's a tension underlying a lot of these conflicts that and presumably I think you mean like like not just a tension between different people, but a tension within the same person, between two, right? Okay, I agree that this is true, but I think this is a tension between two different intuitions that the person has, because there isn't just one intuition that you have around a complex issue. There are different feelings that pop up around different aspects of the issue. And then, like, when you were saying the thing about, like, oh, it's really hard for people to intuitively justify slavery, I actually don't think it is. I think this is one of those issues that produces conflicting intuitions, and it certainly, like, the anti-slavery intuitions are the ones that we're going to be more familiar with, because those are the ones that are everywhere in the society that we live in, right? But when you look at how many different societies over different places and times have done slavery and have maintained it for thousands of years at a time, I think that's like pretty strong evidence that it's not actually that hard for people to intuitively rationalize having it. You know, just like
I think people can rationalize or have some intuition and justification of slavery, but I think that when you look at, and I'm more familiar with chattel slavery in America than anywhere else in the world, and I do think that it is worthy of separating that as a unique kind of slavery.
Sure.
I don't think I'm disagreeing with the specific points you're having, that this is a tension between intuitions, yes, but I think that the resolution, the way you see those intuitions play out, is not on the basis of which intuition is stronger, but on the basis of which rationalization makes more sense to people. And that this, or at the very least, not that that's necessarily happening more, but it's happening a significant amount of the time. A significant amount of the time, the way people are resolving this tension is not just through fifis, but through actually thinking out their trying to think out their positions and come to a logical conclusion. Now, that could still be that logical conclusion can still be based off of intuitions. And indeed, I think this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, is the desire to have a logically consistent morality just itself an intuition?
I think it is, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Okay, then I think we actually do agree. On that level, I do agree. But it's still, but the way that it plays out is still really different than people just being 100% in their feelings. And I think it's a difference that is meaningful, and so it should be acknowledged.
Okay, yeah, so I agree that there is a bunch of logical thinking that goes on as part of the process. I think that, you know, our desire to have logically consistent beliefs is an intuition. You know, it's a thing that we feel uncomfortable when the you know, contradictions are pointed out or something like that, right? There was a thing that you said that was like, part of what's going on is that people will decide which logical argument is better or more persuasive to them, right? What was it exactly? You said something like that?
I think the way that people resolve the tensions between intuitions, a significant portion of that is a genuine good faith attempt of them resolving their own moral logic inside their head.
Okay, yes, so I agree that people try to do this, and then I think that the way that they decide which logical argument is more persuasive to them is but with their fifis.
Maybe. I think it really starts to become a question of what do you mean in their fifis, because the way I see this is there is a part of it that is in their fifis, but then the part that is logic is based on the fifis, but it in and of itself is like the conclusion that a computer would come to if you gave it the same like starting point. Like the part where people are practicing logic isn't perfect, but there is a part where it is more where I think it is much more towards that, like the ideal of logical reasoning that would be that a computer would replicate, assuming that you gave the computer the starting point of you value these feelings, you value these, I guess, variables in the computer's sense as opposed to feelings for us. You value human suffering, being logically consistent, freedom, security, these kinds of things come to a conclusion. I think that process that the computer is doing, there are parts of significant parts of human moral reasoning that more closely resemble that than being in your feelings.
Okay, so I think on the surface level that is true, that people do a lot of operations that kind of mimic a purely logical approach, and you know, if you were to just read out the text of what they're saying, I would agree that people are engaging in this type of process. But then I guess what I'm saying is like that in terms of what effect those logical arguments actually have, the power that they have to persuade people or not persuade people is gatekept on by how people feel about the argument and how they feel about how the conclusion that they're drawing, right? So
when you say changing people's minds, are you talking internally or talking to other people?
Both.
Okay, I would agree externally. I would agree a lot less internally. I think externally, the context of talking with a person causes like your psychology to throw up a bunch of like shields and defenses, and then you start tricking yourself. But I think internally there is a much more substantive conflict that brews, and basically that's what you're trying to access when you change people's minds. You're planting seeds of doubt that then they have to internally work through, and I think that process does look a lot more like the computer, even though it's not perfect and it's not all of the process.
Yeah, okay. So I mean I still well, I was with you right up until the end there, where you said like it looks a lot more like the computer, because that's still not how I conceive of it. But I agree that with the idea of like you can plant seeds in people's thought processes, and then you can like get them to look at things in different ways, and then maybe they have some feeling about that later that ends up persuading them. But I think a lot of what's implicitly going on, a lot of the subtext of logical arguments, is that like if you and I have two different opinions, it's like, okay, you know, you've got an intuition that your opinion is right, and I've got an intuition that my opinion is right, and so then when we have an argument about it, we're just saying like, oh, but what about all these other things that are associated with the thing that we're disagreeing about? We have feelings about those too, right? And it's like so then the more like comparisons I bring in, it's kind of like in I don't know, it's like this battle of trying you know, like if I'm trying to either make you feel negatively about your position or positively about my position, but by just like bringing in comparisons to things that you feel negatively or positively about. I think that's mostly the subtext.
Yeah, I think I can agree there. I just think that's only one piece of the puzzle, and there is a separate piece that is more sort of based in the logic of the computer, or is trying to get towards there.
It's funny because I think the argument we're having right now, it's sort of like I'm being Jonathan Haidt and you're being Sam Harris, right? About like, because like right at the beginning they were talking. Sam Harris was kind of taking the position of like, oh, the specific doctrines of religion matter, and it matters like what people think about them when taken literally, and you know, and then I'm kind of doing the thing of like, yeah, but what about the context of the psychological context and the feelings that people have about, I don't know. Like, I don't think I have anything more to add on this particular point, though.
Right. But what I always read you as suggesting there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you move from that fact to suggest that there clearly can be no truth of the matter, right? The fact that people will hold...
Wait. No, I don't think I ever do that. I would not say that the existence of moral dumbfounding tells us nothing about whether or not there's moral truth. You and I disagree about moral truth, but that's unrelated to dumbfounding. That's more of a philosophical argument about the different kinds of things that are true.
Well, that's an implication I wouldn't want you to draw, and if you don't draw it, that's great.
Let's talk about, you know, I mean, I'm very fond of this term anthropocentric versus non-anthropocentric truths. Should we talk about that?
Well, let me just connect it to another term that people are aware of, moral relativism. Would you consider yourself a moral relativist?
No, but I'm also not a moral realist. So no, I'm not a moral relativist. I think there are moral truths, but they are not the same as the truths of chemistry and physics.
So, and just to get everyone up to speed on what we just said, the idea of moral relativism is, you know, this can mean many different things, and it's a little confusing. I mean, in some ways, even my own view can be called a version of moral relativism, because I believe that there are multiple distinct and yet incompatible possible good lives that people could live, or good societies that could be built. In my book, The Moral Landscape, I say that there are potentially many and even a potentially infinite number of peaks on the moral landscape.
Yep, I like that metaphor and agree with that argument, yes.
But that doesn't undercut the reality of moral truth, because there are many ways to be off a peak and down in a valley that is purely an area of misery. So the fact that there are many right answers to a question doesn't mean there isn't a difference between a right and wrong answer. But the phrase moral relativism is more usually applied to people who think that just to speak in terms of moral truth is to engage in one or another species of fallacious thinking, that there are no truths that that are really true in the sense that things can be scientifically or historically or economically true. And I now recall that one of your mentors was or is Richard Schwader, the anthropologist, and I've actually collided with him both in private and in print briefly on this topic. And he always struck me as a relativist of the latter type. Is that true? And I mean, do you have a difference in your orientation?
You know, Rick is so smart and subtle that almost any category you want to put him in, if you ask him if he fits in it, you won't get a yes or no answer, or the answer will be no. So I don't, I can see why you would call him a relativist. He's some sort. He considers himself a pluralist, and I do too. I consider myself and him a pluralist, and I was very influenced by him on that. So, actually, can I please introduce this concept, because I think this really clarifies everything for me. Because so philosophers have gone round and round about relativism and realism for a long time. And while I was working with Rick Schwader, when I was a postdoc at the University of Chicago, the first thing he had me read just about was an essay by the philosopher David Wiggins. Which completely changed my thinking about this, and I've never had a reason to change it since then. Wiggins simply introduces this distinction between different kinds of facts. There are anthropocentric facts, which are true only because of the kinds of creatures we are, and there are non-anthropocentric facts, which are true regardless of the kinds of creatures we are, regardless of whether we ever evolved or existed. So the Earth is the third planet from the sun. If aliens come here, they'll find that. Copper is a better conductor of electricity than aluminum. It doesn't matter if we never invented electricity. That is still true.
Careful, because even the distinctions that we make are in a certain way formed. This is sort of, I think the balancing act is, this is true, but even that lower tier is still fundamentally informed by our consciousness and our conscious experience, right? Like
we get to decide what counts as a planet, that kind of thing. Is that where you're going with that?
Yeah.
So the kind of truths that you talk about in the moral landscape, you're mostly focused on truths of the natural sciences. We all agree those are true. Those are true facts. They're true regardless of human participation in them. And the question is, are moral facts the same kinds of facts as those? You say yes, I say no. But that doesn't make me a relativist, because there are many other kinds of facts. So the clearest case for me is facts that emerge because of our interactions with each other. So if I say to you that silver is more valuable than gold, now I'm perfectly free to say I like silver more than gold, but that's not a claim about a fact. But I'm going to tell you right now, Sam, gold is more valuable than silver. That's not my opinion. That's a fact. Now, that's not a fact of the natural sciences. It's not true on other planets. It's an emergent fact because we interact with each other in certain ways.
Well, it's socially constructed. Yes.
No. Social construction means that we attach certain meanings to it, like, cancer is a mark of moral depravity or something. People have thought that was a social construction. This is an emergent truth, and emergent truths can be true even if people don't even know that they're true. So markets can yield prices, and prices can move even if people aren't really aware of the movements of the prices.
Well, yeah, but that's true. But markets are still social construction. I mean, so like money is the social construct.
That's right.
Yes.
So true. Markets are human creations, but as markets interact, they generate economic facts. Let's take a more challenging one. Should women have equal political rights? We all say yes. Now, is that a fact true across species, that any intelligent creatures, if they have sexual divergence on a different planet, it'll be true for them? Is it true? Is it a fact such that even if we go back 10,000 years ago, in which women almost never had equal political power, they were all wrong, all human societies were wrong until the 1960s? This is a more challenging case. But I would argue this. Given the way we live now, where the basic unit of politics is the individual, there is no good reason, and it would be unethical, to deny women equal political access and political participation. But for thousands of years, people didn't live that way. People lived in which, let's just say in many societies, the family was the basic unit, and there was a division of labor. The man was the political actor. The woman handled more the domestic sphere and gathering, while the man did hunting. So if you just accept that that's the way hunter-gatherers lived, now, can you say that it is a fact that women should have had equal political power? They should have been present at all the political. They were just wrong that they denied that. So I don't think that makes any sense. I think that women's equality is an emergent fact about the way we live now. It is not a fact like chemistry, like copper being a good conductor. What do you think? Do you think women's equality is a fact like the superior conductivity of copper?
Well, not quite. It's certainly a more complicated fact. But here's why I think this bright line between anthropocentric and other truths doesn't get you very far. Because one, my interest in morality extends beyond what is even human. I'm talking about what possible minds there are in this universe. I mean, just what sorts of experiences are there to have given just the nature of consciousness and how it arises in a universe. So if we wind up building conscious computers that can suffer, how can they suffer and how wrong would it be to build those things? If we can change our brains in the future in such a way as to give ourselves different moral intuitions, right? So not only to live more faithfully by the intuitions we have, but to then ask the question, what intuitions should we have, right? If we could change ourselves into a species of perfectly matched masochists and sadists, would it be wrong to do so? I think those are coherent questions, but they kind of fly the boundaries that you're setting for anthropocentric and other truth claims. And so for me, it's really, I view it as the strong claim I want to make about moral truth and its connection to science, and again, science in the most open-ended way. I mean, the science we will be talking about 10,000 years from now, whatever we are, if we're around to talk about anything. The connection is, I mean, you can even forget about the word morality, forget that we've even have this term, forget that we've evolved to the point we have, and just ask yourself, what possible experiences are there in this universe? And that just faces us with a navigation problem. We're at our starting point, wherever we are now or in the future. And if we move one way, we'll become both individually and collectively reliably more miserable, right? And if you move far enough in that direction, you can become so miserable that there's just no redeeming quality at all.
Ceteris paribus. Yeah. If you keep everything else constant, more misery is worse than less misery. I'm with you on that.
Right. And then who knows how good human life or beyond human life can be given perfect cooperation, creativity of a sort we can't even currently imagine, technology that has no downside, free energy, everything is powered by starlight, and we just are living in some perfect condition that we may in fact never attain given our, humble apish origins, but is in fact possible for minds differently constituted than our own, right? So we're living in that space, and we're navigating in that space of possibility. And then so when you ask a question like, well, should women be given the vote, or should they live as equals to men politically? Then I think that yes, the moral landscape very likely allows for incompatible, but possibly equally flourishing conditions where in some societies, women, for whatever reason, decide they don't really care about politics and they just want to be the best moms possible. And they have made that choice for reasons in this counterfactual history that are slightly different than our own. And, I could imagine some conditions still of flourishing there that is every bit as good as the one we are attempting to navigate toward. But given where we are and given our history, I would agree with you that obviously having women be the political equals of men is the right thing, and everyone else in our current world committed to some other project there is obviously doing it for reasons that are rationally and ethically indefensible, and creating some rather, again, I'm happy to use these certainty terms, creating rather obvious harms in their own societies, both to the boys and the girls, and the women and the men, and the ultimate case being Afghanistan under the Taliban, or the Islamic State now. And if you look at what life for women and girls is there,
there's a level
horrible.
Of brutality and exploitation. A society ravaged by tends not to be one in which you find much humanity, and so the way that women are treated, I'm with you on seeing those societies and the lives for women and men as horrific. But the thing I want to check with you is you talked about consciousness wherever it is. Suppose that there was intelligent life on another planet, we make contact with it. All we know is that it is conscious and it is intelligent. Are you saying that we could say, if we followed out the program of research and thinking in the moral landscape, are you saying that we could say what is right for them? We could actually deduce some moral truths that would apply to them, even if we don't know anything about their evolutionary history. Is that your claim?
This comes down to the difference between answers in practice and answers in principle. So the way I illustrate this always at this point is just to say that there are many scientific questions that are trivially easy to state and have a trivially easy answer, and yet they're perpetually out of reach. In fact, we can't even imagine what would allow us to answer them. And
Okay, but
the one here is just how many birds are in flight over the surface of the Earth at this moment, right?
This is a little different, because what I'm saying is, do you think that knowing the evolutionary history is essential for making statements about their morality or not? Is it just the fact that they can experience and they're rational?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that enough for you that in theory you could derive some moral truths?
Well, yeah, it's totally irrelevant in the sense that you could create a new species now that has no evolutionary history, right? You've just stamped it onto creation, or create the first conscious computer, and it would still be reasonable to ask whether that thing, that conscious system, was suffering, and if so, how much, or it's happy. Or...
Granted, suffering is one dimension, but I raise it to, but what would you say about rights? I think it's something you don't talk a lot about in the moral landscape, if I remember. So think about it this way, and I think Darwin actually even speculated on this, about so suppose we find life on another planet, and suppose we find that it reproduces sexually as we do as individuals, but then we find a different planet where it seems similar, except that they reproduce clonally. So each individual is an exact copy of the other ones within its community or its nation or whatever it is. And I would submit to you that if we know that one species reproduces clonally, we can predict that they would not have notions of individual rights like the one that reproduces sexually. And I don't think that we can say that the one that reproduces, well, they're wrong. They need to get notions of individual rights. They shouldn't be treating their people like that. So my point is that there are anthropocentric truths, and they emerge from the kind of species that it is. And so what is morally true for a species that reproduces clonally by direct, copying with exactly the same genome, sort of like the Borg on Star. Well, the Borg's different, but that. Facts about the origin, can tell you facts about the psychology. Facts about the psychology can tell you whether certain whole categories of moral truths, such as rights, are relevant or not.
Again, this comes down to the different projects in science, one being descriptive and one being normative. And so descriptively, yes, knowing a creature's evolutionary history will tell you a lot about what it's likely to want, what it's likely to find to be a source of suffering, what it's likely to think is morally salient, in the sense that what is relevant in regulating its social attitudes and behavior with other creatures in its environment, and conspecific. So it's morality emerges once you have more than one sentient being. So if you're alone on an island, I don't think morality is a problem, but well-being is still a problem. So our moral concerns are a subset of a deeper concern about well-being. And
well, that's your definition.
Yes.
On your definition, that's right. Everything's consistent, and we have different definitions of morality.
Perhaps we should go there. I think it's. I don't know if I fully answered your question. I think the history is actually irrelevant moving forward toward answering the question of what will maximize the possible well-being of you and those around you, given what you are. We have to leave the monkey behind, in our case, in so many ways. We have to get rid of tribal violence. We have to get rid of our disgust circuitry that misfires in all sorts of ways, that leading us to condemn people for things that shouldn't be considered moral infractions. We have an understandable set point emotionally and physiologically on various topics based on evolution, but we're in the process of rejecting many of those levels, and that's
morality evolves culturally,
and morality consists in our finding our way through that maze toward a circumstance where more and more people flourish. Right. So
that's your conception of morality, and that's all coherent and consistent.
Tell me how it's not yours. So if I told you there's one way you can live that's going to get you everything you want in life, but it's going to come at a massive cost to some little girl somewhere who's going to be made miserable by it, or there's another way you can live that's just as good as the first. You're going to get everything you want in life.
That's fine. I agree with you.
But the little girl's also going to flourish. So you're committed to more general flourishing as well. Right.
As I said, ceteris paribus, more flourishing is better than less. It's just a question of whether this is all there is the experiences, and we add up the experiences. And as I said in one of my replies to you, what the view you're taking is kind of like Dan Kahneman's early work on happiness, where he thought that you add up the total moments of happiness, and whatever life has more of those moments is the better one. but he changed his mind. And one of the reasons is because while our experience of suffering and flourishing is important, there are other elements. And a big part of it is the story we tell about ourselves, our sense of meaning. It isn't just the total number of moments. And I always do this with my students. I ask them, which life would you rather have? One in which the total, and I draw out graphs, one in which the total amount of happy moments or pleasure is, 50% more over the life, which is huge. But, in the last 10 or 20 years, the story you have about your life is that you were an utter failure. So it's our sense of meaning, our sense of narrative. There's more to a happy life than moments of flourishing. And this is why I don't think you could measure with an fMRI scan or any other tool. You can't just measure the amount of happiness or pleasure, add it up, and say this life is better than that.
Actually, that's a good point, because I argued with Danny Kahneman about this over a dinner. Unfortunately, this wasn't public. This was just private argument, but it was a very interesting conversation because I pressed him on precisely this point. The terminology he was using at that point was the experienced self and the remembered self.
Yeah, right.
And so the remembered self is this retrospective look. So if you were just going to sample someone's experience moment by moment and you stick in your well-being detector and just see how happy they were, that would be the experienced self moment by moment. But the remembered self is when you ask them, how good is your life? How happy are you? How actualized are you? How do you feel about your future? Then you get these broader answers that summarize the last year of their life or so.
Right, but I'm talking about something even beyond that, because even that is still just about happiness. How much happiness do you remember that you had? I'm saying there are levels of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of accomplishment. There's things beyond just how much happiness you remember.
Right, sure, and we can bundle all of that into this remembered self, right? Remembered self is the only one you can talk to. His point is that whenever you ask someone how happy you are, they are always giving you the remembered self's version of it. And so when you talk to people, they talk about, again, and I fully agree, they talk about more than just moment-to-moment pleasure. They're not aspiring to be successful heroin addicts. They want more out of life. They want a sense of meaning. They want connections. They want a story that they can tell about themselves. All of it, right? And some of those things that they achieve come at the expense of an obvious diminishment in moment-to-moment pleasure, right? So people will go through ordeals to get to what this thing that they think they want.
That makes a good story.
So I still think the area under the curve is the final answer here. It's just that you have to be clear about what's under the curve. So
okay. Hey, could I suggest, actually, given that we're going to run out of time, I have office hours coming up, and I think the campus political correctness and political correctness in general is something you and I care a lot about. And I think I saw on Twitter a lot of your listeners are asked that we talk about it. So I'm just going to suggest that, given that we're running out of time, we move on to that.
Okay, well, let's table that. But I would just say to you that there's more than what you or Danny have said on that topic, and we can talk about it at some other point. So what the hell is going on politically? And you've pointed this out in
I just was thinking, we've sat here for the last 10 minutes. I've listened to all this stuff that was like, I was pretty interested in what they were saying. I just didn't feel like I had a lot to add over that, but I just wanted to ask, what did you think about this last segment of conversation that they were having?
I think it's pretty dumb to say that there's anything I don't think there's moral facts, and it feels like I've never really understood Sam Harris's, and it's something I've deeply looked into, but the idea that Sam Harris does believe in moral facts, but is completely atheistic, I've never really understood. It felt like they were mostly just, I think I agree with everything they're saying. What's true for us might not be true for others. The idea that there's, the facts that are only true and contextual to us. But it just seemed like they were mostly just agreeing and moving on, to be honest.
Okay. I remember it's been a long time since I've listened to Sam Harris talk about this, but I at one point I had a pretty good understanding of what his take was, and I think I can mostly recapitulate it now, which is I think he's essentially just taking it for granted that what we're trying to do is to maximize the well-being of conscious creatures, I think is the way that he says it, right? So I remember when we were talking about moral philosophy a few weeks ago, I think it seemed like we mostly agreed that there probably aren't universalizable moral facts, but if you specify a certain set of values in a certain context, then from there you can get objective moral facts about about how to maximize that set of values in that context. And I think what Sam Harris is doing is just saying yeah, but there's only like one set of values in one context that I care about, and like so therefore like the moral facts that I'm talking about are just the context is that we are conscious creatures, and the value system is that we have experiences that we prefer versus experiences that we don't prefer, and then he just kind of is running from there. I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like, okay, but if like I feel like that's mostly my position, but like, bro, that's not what a fact is. Like, if you're taking it for granted, then it doesn't seem like you've truly morally proved it in any real sense.
Yeah, I agree. I was never really like super happy with the way that he talked about that, but I think I wish he would just like caveat it a little more, and then I could agree with him. Oh, I love the cat.
Yeah.
I know I'm super distracted, but
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's no problem. I just love cats. Anyway, yeah, I do wish he would caveat what he's saying a little bit more. That he's like, it's like, well, there are like air quotes objective moral facts, but only objective in the sense that like they objectively follow from this set of assumptions that I expect us to all agree on. I don't know.
Yeah.
But which in fact we don't all agree.
Many different ways in the past. There's a level of there are different blind spots on the left and right, politically and morally, and the conversation between the two, or lack thereof, plays out in really bewildering ways at this point. So give me your thinking at the moment on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I've been extremely alarmed by the way campus culture at a lot of our top schools has changed radically just in the last 2 years. There are these new ideas.
I really hope this isn't.
I hear undergraduates often saying things.
I really hope this isn't just going to be like a circle jerk fest of them both talking about how campus culture is crazy. That's going to be so boring.
I think it is. I think they're both going
to take it for granted.
Complain about the SJWs.
Safe space. Now, if they mean that the teacher shouldn't insult people or people shouldn't hit each other, of course. But what they mean is that people should not be exposed to ideas that might make them feel marginalized or demeaned. For example, if somebody were to question affirmative action, that could be threatening to students who might have benefited from affirmative action. Therefore, you can't question it. And it's very strange that people are getting in trouble. And I was dragged before the Equal Opportunity Commission for showing a video that in class that one student objected to one word that a student said in it. All this weird, weird.
What was the word?
Disgusting. So it was in the context of a discussion about the dumbfounding scenario, actually. And it was a conversation between two UVA undergraduates, and one of them he's cross-examining the other one. The experimenter cross-examines the other one, and the guy ultimately says, well, I don't know, I can't explain why it's wrong. Well, I guess I just, I have a sister myself, and I would just find it disgusting to watch, to think about having sex with her. Mm. So the experimenter follows the script, which is, because people often say something like that. And so the experimenter says, well, okay, you'd find it disgusting, but does that make it wrong? I mean, personally, like if I were to see two men having sex, like I personally would find that disgusting. I wouldn't want to watch it. But, that doesn't make it wrong. I mean, if people are inclined that way, they have every right to do it. There's nothing wrong with it. So, okay, so, I've shown this video 50 times. But by the time class was over, a student had emailed the dean to complain about my homophobia. I thought she must have just missed the part. She must have misunderstood the video. I mean, I said, well, come talk to me tomorrow. Let's look at the. You'll see. He's not condemning homosexuality. He's actually pro-gay rights. But she engineered. Basically, she brought the class to a standstill. She demanded that I apologize, and finally, she bullied me into apologizing. And finally, I did, just because I had to keep the class going. And this was because it was an intensive class every day for a week. So I apologized, but she didn't like the apology, so she brought me in front of the Equal Opportunity Commission. Which then there was no way that they were going to convict me.
And this is at UVA?
No, it's at NYU. But the point is, it took like about a month out of my life. And during that time, she mounted a social media. She had other people mount a social media campaign, writing things about how homophobic I am. So it was really a nightmare. And I was so like, what the hell is going on? Like, where is it? It just didn't make any sense. I mean, I've been parts of groups pushing for gay rights. My research is on disgust. Actually, I have a paper showing how you can reduce prejudice against gay people. So I felt like, my intentions are all in the right place. I didn't say anything. What's going on? And then other things similar to that happened to me, and then began happening to lots of other people. And this is in the 2013 to 2014 academic years when this all begins to happen. The campus disinvitations, the words trigger warning and safe space, they barely exist before 2012, but by 2014 they're everywhere. And this is why when Greg Lukianoff, who's the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, when he came to me in the summer of 2014 with his diagnosis that, John, this weirdness going on campus, it's exactly the errors that I learned about in cognitive therapy. Like campus is teaching undergraduates to think in the exact distorted ways that cognitive therapy teaches you not to do, like catastrophizing, mind reading, all those sorts of things. And so I was so busy. I was saying no to everything. But when Greg came to me after my own experiences, I said, "Oh my God, Greg, this is brilliant. This is what's going on." So that's what led to he and I writing this article that was published in The Atlantic last August. And it was, and we had no idea campuses were going to melt down beginning at Halloween at Yale, Missouri, so many other schools. So a very strange thing is happening, and I think it's so interesting. I mean, it's horrible because it basically has put a chill on free speech. Everyone is afraid of saying anything that will set off the most sensitive student in the class. Professors all over the country are scrubbing their syllabi clean. We're not showing videos that could provoke. We're not saying things. So education is taking a nosedive in this country because everyone's afraid of a big social media storm or being charged with marginalizing or whatever it is. So this is what's happening, and
this is purely a liberal phenomenon, right? Is there a conservative analog to this, or is this just
a little bit? Yeah. So what happens? So there's a wonderful paper on the origin of microaggressions. In fact, if listeners just Google where microaggressions really come from, I wrote a summary of this article, and what these authors, Manning and Campbell, two sociologists, what they point out is that microaggressions, the idea of these, the idea that, like, if I ask an Asian student, "Where are you from?" that's a microaggression because I'm implying that he or she is not American. The idea that this is an act of aggression is an odd idea, but the whole culture of microaggressions, they point out, only emerges in places that are very, very egalitarian, meaning, so that would be on the left, and also that have administrative bodies that will punish opponents. So it's the very presence of all the diversity committees, all the ways you can punish people for saying things you don't like. This is why the most progressive places in America, like Yale, Amherst, Brown, the schools that are erupting in riots are the most progressive left-leaning places. And it's because the whole idea of seeing everything as a microaggression only flourishes in those places. But to answer your question, once you get this dialogue of, "I've been traumatized, I've been offended against, you've committed violence against me." Once you get people on the left saying that about everything, the few people on the right, and there's often a minority, I mean, there are some conservatives at Yale, Brown, and Amherst, they then start using that language too. So you do see occasional examples of people on the right claiming that they've been traumatized or microaggressed, but it is mostly a left. It mostly comes from the social justice left.
This is a recent phenomenon, but this seems to be of a piece with something that isn't so recent. So, like, for instance, these no-go areas in science, these taboo topics like racial and gender differences in intelligence, the bell curve wars, and, Larry Summers getting into hot water at Harvard. And I think you wrote about this some years ago in an Edge piece. You speculated that mapping the genome is going to open up a much larger front in this war of controversial topics. So, have you thought any more about that? I can imagine that this is only making it that much more difficult to touch any of these areas scientifically if you can't even talk about them in front of your classroom.
That's right. So political correctness is not new. Even back in the 60s, there were all kinds of things you could not say. There was a big wave of it in the early 1990s and hate speech codes, all that sort of stuff. What's new is the idea that students, or people, but especially students, are so fragile that if they're exposed to something that is an offensive idea, they will be traumatized, they will be damaged. And that wasn't there in the 90s. In the 90s, the idea was, this is an incredible injustice, you're a bad person for saying this, you're a bad person for studying this. But there wasn't the idea that, oh, you've traumatized people, you've damaged people.
So I think what's new is putting it in pop psych terms.
And this grows out. I've learned a lot since Lukianoff and I wrote The Atlantic.
Like a different way of describing the same problem, because centuries ago there were blasphemy laws under the assumption that people who hear blasphemous ideas are susceptible to being corrupted by them or something, and that
or a satanic panic, sort of similar thing. Kids, just by virtue of experiencing these things, are going to be damaged.
Yeah, so I think what Jonathan Haidt is describing is not actually a new thing, but I think it's just a new set of terminology for things that we've been experiencing for
It's relatively new, particularly in universities. I think the thing he's talking about here is, as opposed to what happened in universities before, this is new here. But yeah, it's definitely not new to to the human race or anything like that. I think the other thing is as much as I hate to say it, it's the iPhones. I think social media and interconnectivity of this degree is really just like many things. It's poured gasoline on a fire that's always been there. It's not new, but it's certainly a lot hotter now than it has been in a long, long time.
Maybe. I went to a very leftist university, and I experienced a lot of the same stuff before 2013. So it really didn't just come up out of nowhere, but maybe it's more widespread today.
Yeah, I think that's the only difference, really.
Yeah.
This ultimately seems to grow out of the massive changes in child rearing that happened in the United States after the early 1980s. So,
how do you know that?
if you
Come
were born
on.
before about 1975, then you had a childhood like people all over the world have always had, which is that you spent a lot of time without
that's
adult
very
supervision.
objectionable what he's saying now, because I think like mid to late 20th century America was much more atomized and focused on this like nuclear family concept than almost any other society has ever been. I think when people around the world in most historical times and places were living in community, like first of all, mostly smaller communities, much less urbanized. Secondly, they're mostly living in a way where they're physically in touch with their neighbors, talking to more people face to face instead of watching TV all the time. They're not taking cars to drive around to all these to different places. They are being raised by their extended family and not just their mother and father. And I think every one of these things contributes like pretty significantly to people's social development, and it's obviously going to have some effect on how sensitive people are to ostensibly traumatizing social stimuli. So to think that people who were raised in America before 1975, like that's just the normal way the world is. It's like, no, I think it's just like Jonathan Haidt was raised in America before 1975, and so that's what he thinks of as normal.
Yeah, I'll let him fully finish the statement before I go too hard.
Okay.
People all over the world have always had, which is that you spent a lot of time without adult supervision. And sometimes you got in fights, sometimes you got lost, sometimes you got scared, and you'd figure it out yourself. But we had a real crime wave beginning in the 70s, and there were several high-profile abductions, especially Eitan Pate's 3 blocks south of where I'm sitting right now in Greenwich. And right around the time of Eitan Pate's, just after that, we get cable TV. And once we get cable TV, we have constant 24-hour coverage of every child abduction. So even though pretty much nobody abducts children other than the non-custodial parent, Americans came to fear that if they ever had kids unsupervised, those kids would be abducted. It is literally illegal to let your 8-year-old walk to a park 2 blocks away. You can be arrested for doing that. So parents don't do that. Kids are never without adult supervision until they're mid-teens in many cases. And so what happens is students get to college and they have not had a chance to really deal with setbacks and even insults on their own. There's always been some authority that they should appeal to. So they get to college and somebody says something. Maybe somebody criticizes affirmative action, and that hurts. They don't like it. So what do? They have this whole ideology built for them. They might even have encountered it before college, that says that they are a victim of microaggression. Somebody, perhaps a professor, although professors are always on the left, so it might not have been.
I don't think this is really explanatory of the specific culture of microaggressions. Like I have heard of the idea of the relatively newer phenomenon of helicoptering helicoptering parents, or of kids not being able to go out and walk around, which also worth bearing out has a lot to do with zoning and the fact that in order to get anywhere, kids probably need to get in a car for 10, 15 minutes, and they really can't walk or bike around. But I'd be really surprised if there is actually good evidence for the idea that, this is why. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that kind of really good evidence doesn't exist, because it's a really difficult thing to even select for in the first place. Okay, let's look at all the kids who went to colleges across the country who didn't have this kind of thing. Well, that's going to be a very difficult thing to do exactly, and how to, sort out the confounding variables. I'd be really surprised if that is. It's an interesting theory, but it seems very difficult to verify or falsify.
Yeah.
Probably more
Okay. So I got two things I wanted to say about this. So first of all, I wanted to try to like invert something that Jonathan Haidt said earlier, because I think I think the point he's making could be better understood if it's just framed differently. Because he was saying, like, well, if you were born in America before 1975, like that, you're just raised like a normal human, right? But I think really the better way to understand what he's trying to say is that more recent American upbringings are abnormal, right? And setting aside whether earlier American upbringings were normal or not.
Yeah, that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah, like I think it's true that in some sense, like, kids do grow up with more supervision now than they have at like most other historical times and places, and that's gonna have some effect on their development. And it at least sounds superficially plausible that if kids are brought up in a way where they don't have to face as much hardship or as much conflict, or then they won't develop the skills that they need to cope with that in a healthy way. And I think that's what he's trying to say.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, but there are a lot of things that make a lot of sense that you shouldn't just assume without some further interrogation of the idea.
Yeah. So this may or may not be true. It does seem superficially plausible. It's at least consistent with the evidence that we have at hand. It still may or may not be true. Yeah.
Most of the complaints are actually about students. So some student said something and it hurts. And so you don't say something back, you go straight to the dean or the diversity administrator. You file charges. So this is what's new. This didn't happen 10 or 15 years ago. This is just the last couple of years. They call it accountability. They say we need to hold professors accountable for what they say. But when everybody in the class is holding the professor accountable for not making them feel bad, I mean, it's like being back in, communist Romania or East Germany. You're speaking to the Politburo, and if you say anything out of line, you're in big trouble.
What explains the fact that the adults are...
I don't think American professors are facing a hardship similar to those who lived under the Soviet Union.
That's pretty hyperbolic. Yeah.
Caving into this. You've just explained why the kids are coming in like this, but why does the administration yield to this pressure?
Because they have painted themselves into a corner. So two things that have happened. One, there's been rising political polarization in the country. Left and right really, really dislike each other more now than they did 20 years ago. So everybody's more politicized, and the administrators and the professors are almost all on the left now. They used to only be about 70 or 80% on the left, or whatever. It used to be 2-to-1 left to right. Now it's about between 5 and 10-to-1 left to right. So you have everybody's increasingly polarized. Everybody's on board with fighting conservatives. Conservatives are bad. There's a kind of a new religion. In fact, linking back to everything we talked about before, our religious minds have created a new religion of social justice. On campus, the religion is social justice. The most sacred thing in the world is the victim, especially the African-American victim. We have blasphemy laws. If someone questions affirmative action, that's blasphemy. It is literally defined as a microaggression to question affirmative action. Eric Posner, son of Richard Posner, associated questioning affirmative action with Holocaust denial. So there are blasphemy laws now. So it's become a religion. And so once this religion of social justice has taken root in the humanities and increasingly the social sciences, now the presidents of the universities, faced with demands from students, cannot say no. They cannot say,
I don't know about
in fact,
literally
maybe you do need to toughen up. Maybe you just need to, sometimes students are going to say things to you. Maybe some of them are even racist, but, we can't have a committee prosecuting every time someone says something offensive. They can't say that. So what they have to do is they have to say, you're right. As the president of Yale said, we have failed you. So the students give him an ultimatum. They say, President Salovey, we demand that you do these things. You must respond by Wednesday. Now, if you're the president of the university, what should you do? Should you respond by Wednesday? But he has to, or rather, I shouldn't say he has to. He chose to. And so all over the country, presidents are caving, they're giving in, they're validating this victim narrative, and they're promising to do things like more microaggression training, more diversity training, which are going to make things worse. I've been reviewing the literature on this. Diversity training, especially if it's done in a vindictive way, backfires. So it's a disaster. What's going on campus is a disaster.
I'm not on a campus, so I really just have to ask people like you. But my perception of this problem, just reading articles like your own and seeing people push back against it, as you are doing here and as you did in your article, I guess I've been too sanguine about this. My sense was that this problem must be, if not on the verge, at least it's in the process of being pushed back, right? You seem to be saying that it's going to get a lot worse.
What people don't understand, if you're not on a college campus now, if you graduated before 2013, you have no idea what's going on, because this only emerged in 2013, 2014 at a few places, and then it spread. Now, last fall is when it spread. So we're now living in a world of social media where ideas can spread so fast that would have taken years before. So if you graduated before 2013, you haven't seen this stuff.
It kind of has the.
I agree with the overall message. I think all the campus stuff is really bad. It's really not good, and it is a travesty. I don't know if it's nearly as universal as he is putting here. I have some experience in universities, and I know a lot of people that go to many different universities, and certainly this stuff does happen. I'm not trying to minimize it, but I think he's being a little a little hyperbolic when he's talking about the degree to which it is everywhere, or he seems to be implying that it's everywhere in universities. I don't think this is the case. Yale and a lot of these big time universities are going to be selecting for, the most radical. So I don't think it's fair to use that experience to paint, the many, many state schools where this is still happening, sure, but to a much lesser degree.
Okay, so it's not East Germany when you go to university.
Yeah. Maybe I need to, head to the cafeteria and check in, but that's not been my experience or the experience of anyone I know who's been in these institutions in the last 5-6 years.
Mm-hmm.
Character of what we often call a moral panic.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. It's a moral panic. But it only makes sense given the new religion of social justice. Social justice has become the religion of the humanities and parts of the social sciences, not the natural sciences. Natural sciences still work like real sciences.
Right. I've been noticing the problems in liberalism of late, and I've called myself a liberal for as long as I've had any political identity at all, and I reliably align with liberal principles on, I check almost every box except once we start talking about things like the clash of civilizations and the problem with political Islam, and then all of a sudden I sound, or at least I'm attacked as something more like a conservative on those topics. But I don't even know why I still call myself a liberal, given how endemic this confusion is in liberalism. And there's something, you don't call yourself a liberal anymore. You're a centrist, right?
That's right. But there's two things going on. So America screwed up the word liberal. We have no idea what it means.
Oh, come on. Every political label gets abused like this. Just because liberal used to mean a very different thing many, many years ago doesn't mean it has absolutely no worthwhile meaning now, or doesn't conform to how other countries use the word liberal.
I think it doesn't conform to the way that Sam Harris is necessarily using the word liberal, though, right? Because when he says that this is a liberal problem, I think the type of people he's talking about are not going to self-identify as liberals, just because it has become kind of somewhat synonymous with like center-left, sock them stuff.
Liberal, if just read John Stuart Mill, classical ideas.
Oh my God! Okay, bro, I've got a great, letter word I like to use to talk about gay people. Just go read a dictionary from 1800. Like, come on, bro.
And here we don't mean hurting my feelings in an indirect way. Unless you're interfering with my life project or hurting me, you can't tell me what to do. So that's liberal. In that sense, you're liberal. I'm liberal. Almost everybody on campus is liberal. Most conservatives are liberal.
Yeah, well, libertarians answer to that description. Yeah.
So that's the word liberal. And in Europe, that's still what it means. We in America began equating liberal with left, and that's a mistake. So I was always on the left, and I think you're saying that you were and are still on the left. As a result of writing The Righteous Mind, I have moved to the center. I'm no longer on the left. I've never voted for Republican, and boy, it's not looking like I'm going to this year either. But I'm no longer on the left. But what's really going on, I think you put your finger on it, is
you're still on the left, by the way, sir. You're just not on that part of the left. Just
illiberalism. So the everybody, all the faculty they call themselves liberal. They're on the left, but there's a huge difference between the illiberal left and the liberal left. The illiberal left is saying You can't use that word. You have to use this word. You can't wear that clothing. That's cultural appropriation. You must do this. We get to say, we get to dictate how everybody lives on campus. That is what is happening. And this is emerging not from the faculty on the left. This is emerging from the students, the illiberal left. It's a small group. It's not most of the students. But the liberal left is afraid to stand up to them, because if you stand up to them, you're racist, you're sexist. So all over, on many campuses, I hear this from so many students and faculty. Somebody will say something outrageous. Many people in the room think, oh my God, that's crazy. But nobody has the guts to stand up because they're afraid of being called racist. But look, any virtue carried to extreme becomes a vice. So egalitarianism carried to extreme, as happened under Mao, says, the people, there's the good class and the bad class, is what Mao said. If you're poor, if you're a peasant, you're the good class. If you owned a business, if you're wealthy, you're the bad class. Basically, what we see on campus now is the ideology of privilege. They're the good people and the bad people. The bad people are those who are privileged, which is all white people, all men, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a rabid egalitarianism that I think has become bad. But the other thing, and this is what's new just recently, is the inclusiveness. So inclusiveness is a good thing. We do need to take affirmative steps to make sure we're not inadvertently marginalizing or alienating African Americans, Latin Americans. So inclusivity is a good thing, but carried to extreme.
Not on the left person, by the way. But whatever.
It becomes bad. And what's happened is in this new religion of social justice, the central virtues are inclusivity and equality. And if anyone in the 7 marginalized groups feels excluded, that trumps everything else. And this is where it becomes bad, and this is where it becomes impossible to have a university, because now we can't, I can't say something. I can't present a scientific theory. I can't present, if we're going to talk about why are women underrepresented in the STEM fields, and if a professor were to say, well, actually, prenatal testosterone actually influences what children enjoy doing, might that be relevant? You can't say that. I mean, I just said it, but a professor on the left can't say that.
So you literally, if you were teaching that subject area, you would feel that you actually had to drop that fact from the lecture?
Me personally, I would be very hesitant to say that at NYU, not that NYU is particularly bad, but because that's where they could file charges against me. But if I'm not at NYU, I'm free to say it, because students at other schools can't really do much to me. But yes, students, I've heard from many professors, they are simply avoiding controversy because it's just not worth the trouble. It can take months of your life.
That's incredible.
But again, the point is that once you make inclusion a sacred value, that means no trade-offs. That means there's 7 marginalized groups. So it's African Americans, women, and gay people, LGBTQ. That's the 3 big ones. Then there's Latinos, Native Americans, disabled or mentally ill. So that's 6. That's where we were for the last 10 or 20 years. But just in the last year, now it's Muslims. Muslims are the 7th. So if you say anything that criticizes Islam, or that would in any way make Muslim students feel uncomfortable, that's racism, that's homophobia. So professors are going to be very, very careful from here on in about saying anything critical of Islam.
Interesting. Well, I guess I can claim to have done my part on that particular thing.
Yeah, good thing you're not a professor.
Yes. So what do you make of our current political landscape? What's now we are talking at the beginning of March, and Donald Trump seems to be virtually guaranteed to be the Republican candidate, and it seems probably it's also going to be Clinton against him. How do you view our future?
Well, I'm extremely alarmed because I've been tracking the rising polarization for a long time, and it's been growing steadily since the 90s, the degree to which we dislike the other side. But we're at an inflection point this year. So even if at one point people thought, well, what if it's Trump versus Sanders? Even if it's going to be Trump versus Clinton, well, each side. So people on the left are much more incredulous about the right that they could have nominated Trump. People on the right are absolutely incredulous that people on the left could have considered nominating a socialist to run the country. So I'm extremely alarmed, not just by the things that Trump says, by the belligerence, the risks that I think he'll expose our country to. And also, let me say, while I think Hillary Clinton is can do the job, and I probably will end up voting for her because I don't see any alternative, I don't like a lot of what she stands for. And she is actually going to be really bad on free speech issues. She is going to double down on the idea that there's a rape culture, which is there's not, this is a whole nother story, but there's a hookup culture. And because of concept creep, we define everything down. But Hillary Clinton is going to make it even harder to have free speech on campus because she's going to even toughen the laws on what counts as harassment and marginalization, all that stuff. So I'm very upset about our choices, but I'm really concerned about our country because the degree to which we dislike and distrust the other side, it's already made it very hard to have compromise, and Congress, many of them feel if they compromise, they'll really get in trouble from their district. They'll get primaried. It's going to get 3 times
I
worse.
wonder if
now.
he'd want to compromise with the people who he's against so much here, right? Like if he thinks
everyone's like, oh, I love working across the aisle until it's time to come to work across the aisle, and they're like, oh, wait a minute.
Right, exactly. So if these, there's this social justice ideology that he's talking about where it's like the progressive far left has these sacred values of inclusivity that just trump everything, and they've got the 7 marginalized groups and they're enacting blasphemy laws to protect it. Like the way he's talking about them does not make it sound like he wants to compromise with them. I don't know.
Yep.
I'm very alarmed for the state of our democracy.
Yeah, I ran a poll on Twitter, which alarmed me. Obviously, it's just a poll of my audience and random people who happen to get forwarded it. So it's not the general population, and it definitely skews liberal. But what it suggested to me is that there are many Sanders supporters who hate Clinton so much and whose basic platform is just rejecting traditional politics that some significant number of them either will not vote or will vote for Trump.
What actually happened was like 80% of them voted for Clinton, and I think some single-digit percent voted for Trump. I think somewhere in the 3 to 3.
Most of them stayed home.
Yeah, a lot of them either stayed home, and then a few of them voted third party, Jill Stein or.
Yeah, it's all driven out. It's mostly all driven just by turnout for each side. It's very rarely about swing voters or voters changing parties or anything like that. It's almost all just trying to get your people to come out more than the other people do, because a bunch of people don't vote in this country. So that's like the place where the biggest gains can be made.
Yeah, so that's kind of how it plays out whenever we have two sides that are very like calcified and very identifiable in terms of like in terms of it when you have two sides that are where it's very easy for each person to know approximately which side they're on, then essentially that's how it's going to work, is just turn out more of your people and also like have more people on your side, right? I think it's so that's how it's been for the last several elections. That's not always historically been the case. Like there have been other times when persuasion was comparatively more important than it is today, and turnout comparatively less important. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
2008, I was one of those people. I really liked Barack Obama, and I really disliked Clinton. And I thought for a while, if Clinton gets the nomination, I would vote for McCain. And that's the way a lot of people felt back then. But once the election comes around, so there's the Bedouin proverb: me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother, and cousin against the stranger. But almost all of them, if it's Clinton versus Trump, almost all of them are going to vote for Clinton. That's my prediction.
Yeah, well, I hope so, because it looks like it's going that direction. And I think I have all of your reservations, I'm sure, about Clinton, but at least she seems like a grown-up who can do the job and not run civilization off a cliff.
That's right.
So fingers crossed, John.
We do live in interesting times, and you and I are studying the central core of what makes things so interesting, I suppose.
Yeah, well, listen, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I'm very glad we got a chance to talk and break our uncomfortable silence.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this time. I really appreciate you reaching out and inviting me on. Thank you. So I look forward to seeing you at a future conference.
Yeah, until next time.
Okay, I actually did think that was a really interesting conversation. I know there were like long stretches of it where I didn't have much to add to it, but I was really interested in listening to what they had to say even during those times, and it is really nice to hear two people that are able to articulate their disagreements with one another as well as these two are.
Yeah, I think so. It's it was really good. I just think there was a lot of could have really benefited from having more of a Destiny Ben Shapiro pace to speaking.
Oh, okay. Like maybe we should have watched it at 1.5 speed or something. I don't know. I didn't think they were
If I was watching this at home, it would have been 3 times speed.
3 times speed. I didn't think they were particularly slow paced about it. Did you think so?
Oh yeah. I'm sick in the head. I mean, sometimes I listen to music at double speed, so that's just me.
Yeah, for anybody that doesn't know, Flowtrace also has a reputation in Twitch, Paul, for being a very fast talking person. So yeah.
Yeah.
But like my perception of this particular conversation was that it went at a roughly average pace and was fairly informationally dense as far as these conversations go. So I don't know. But maybe I'm sick in the head because I'm used to listening to things at only like 1.25 or 1.5 speed or so. I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to add about this before we're done?
Nope, I don't think so.
Okay, well, thanks for joining me. I don't have almost anybody, so I'm not going to bother to raid, but, let's see you around next time.
Yeah, I'm going offline as well. Yeah, see you.
Okay.